legal analysts expect that to happen, but it's not impossible. But more broadly, you get a sense of how the Supreme Court is going to handle this very sensitive situation. Are they going to be put in the middle, as they are today, of a presidential election? Because remember, this is not the only case that's going to come before them. We expect that the Trump team is going to appeal the ruling that we saw earlier this week by the circuit court about whether or not Donald Trump or any president has absolute immunity from criminal prosecution. That's going to be appealed, likely to the Supreme Court. So we're going to see this as the first, potentially, of at least two and maybe more cases that will be central to how this country decides who the next president will be.
Terry, what are you watching for in the hearing as we hear from the attorneys and the justices?
Well, one thing that the justices face is that they really can't duck this case. There's no easy compromise. There's no real precedent. It's all up to them. So they'll be talking to each other, exploring what is the common ground that they have. And it may be, something like the notion of an insurrection and how that vague term can be applied in this situation. In 1868, when the amendment was passed, every American knew that the Civil War had been an insurrection. Do Americans agree on that today? What are the standards for that? And one important piece of information that I expect to hear raised by Trump's lawyers today is that Biden's own Justice Department, Special Counsel Jack Smith, has secured 700 guilty pleas. Not one person has been charged with the federal crime of insurrection. Diane?
All right, Asha Rangappa, Terry Moran, Jonathan Karl, thank you all.
Thank you.
And we will have full coverage of the Supreme Court's arguments throughout the days. Secretary of State Antony Blinken says he believes a hostage deal is still within reach despite Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu rejecting Hamas's counteroffer. This comes as aid organizations are sounding the alarm about Israeli troops advancing toward Rafah. Foreign correspondent James Longman is in Tel Aviv with the latest.
Despite growing pressure to accept a deal to bring home Israel's remaining hostages, Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected a Hamas ceasefire proposal. He called their conditions delusional. Hamas called for the withdrawal of all Israeli troops from Gaza over a 4.5-month ceasefire. Over 3 phases, Hamas would release all hostages, with Israel exchanging prisoners. Instead, the war rages on, and Gaza's last city still standing, Rafah, now in the crosshairs. The UN says 250,000 are sheltering here, but IDF ground troops are now approaching. People here are desperate for a deal. Enough, frankly, enough, says this woman. Find a solution for us. We're destroyed. And hostage families pleading with their prime minister. 34-year-old Sharon Aloni Cuneo telling him, we've reached the moment of truth, the moment when you must decide who lives and who dies. Conscious that time is against them, the IDF says at least 31 of the more than 100 hostages in Gaza are already believed dead. 23-year-old Hersh Goldberg-Polin is one of the Americans believed still in captivity. His mother met the Secretary of State this morning.
We started by saying that there is no time left for these hostages.
What went through your mind when you heard that this ceasefire deal had fallen through? What would you say to Netanyahu right now?
Right now, he's at a crossroads. He could be known as the prime minister who oversaw the tragedy of October 7th and then subsequently brought home 136 body bags. Or he could be known as the prime minister who oversaw October 7th, but brought home as many hostages alive as possible, strengthened the country, put it on a better path, and moved us forward.
So Benjamin Netanyahu is repeating his call for total victory in Gaza. So the IDF is closing in on Rafah, but it is the last refuge in Gaza. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken shelter there. They really don't have anywhere else to go. Diane?
Foreign correspondent James Longman in Tel Aviv, thank you. And intelligence officials are issuing a new warning about Chinese cyber attacks. They say hackers from China spent years in U.S. networks trying to attack American transportation hubs and other critical infrastructure. ABC News Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas has the details on that story. Hi, Pierre.
Diane, good morning. We're getting disturbing new details about China's efforts to secretly infiltrate and potentially attack our key infrastructure and literally our way of life. Diane, we've now learned that some of the covert operations by China began at least 5 years ago. Homeland Security, FBI, and intelligence officials issued a new bulletin yesterday highlighting the Chinese hacking campaign we recently told our viewers about. The warning says China shifted from a strategy of using hacking to commit economic espionage to a strategy of using hacking to disrupt how Americans go about their daily lives. The Chinese cyber warfare involves planting malware on computer networks serving our electrical grid, oil and gas pipelines, our transportation systems, even our water treatment plants. Authorities say the plan will allow China to attack at a time of their choosing. FBI Director Wray sounding the alarm, calling his concern about China the threat of our generation, Diane.
Chief Justice Correspondent Pierre Thomas, thank you. Coming up, a moose on the loose, how skiers are reacting after seeing this barreling down the mountain at a popular resort. Also ahead, what you need to know about electric cars and tax breaks. You asked, and Alexis Christoforous is answering your money questions next. And stay with ABC News Live as the Supreme Court hears arguments on whether former President Trump can be banned from the 2024 ballot. We'll listen to those arguments live when they happen.
Whenever news breaks,
we are here in Israel, a nation at war after that brutal surprise attack by Hamas.
On the ground in Ukraine, reporting from Lewiston, Maine.
The scene of a horrific mass shooting.
ABC News Live is right there everywhere.
From the scene of that deadly missile strike in Dnipro, Ukraine.
Reporting from the earthquake in Turkey.
In Rolling Fork, this tornado tore through this little town.
From the most devastating disaster in Hawaii.
From Charleston, South Carolina, on the 2024 campaign trail.
In Iceland.
Let's go.
Traveling with the president in Mexico City.
Wherever the story.
From the front lines.
From southern Israel. Outside the Gaza Strip.
In Beirut.
From the FBI.
Reporting from the nurses on the picket line.
Here at 10 Downing Street in London.
Streaming live to you.
Wherever the story is.
Wherever the story is.
Wherever the story is. We're going to take you there.
You're streaming.
ABC News Live.
ABC News Live.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live. Streaming free everywhere. America's #1 streaming news.
It's lunchtime in America, so what are we serving up?
Well, how about everything you need to know?
You know, that sounds pretty good.
Give it to me. Your health, your money, breaking news, pop culture, with the biggest stars, music, trends, and of course, good food. GMA 3, what you need to know. A third hour of GMA in the afternoon.
So join us, afternoons.
For everything you need to know. I love that.
All right, here we go. You ready? Let's do it.
Yes, it's the show America wants and America needs right now.
This is What Would You Do? Let's go. How are you?
Hug you.
Yes.
So what will you be watching Saturdays on ABC News Live?
What would you do? Hey, I guess I just found out.
The What Would You Do Marathon, 2 to 6 Eastern, every Saturday on ABC News Live.
My favorite show.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, what would you do if you were out skiing when all of a sudden you were being chased by a giant moose? Well, that's what happened in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the whole thing was caught on camera. Now some of those skiers are sharing their story. ABC's Morgan Norwood has more.
Moose!
This was the moment a massive moose came barreling down the slopes.
Unbelievable.
Headed straight for a group of skiers in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
I caught a little bit of air, and the moose was within 10 feet of me.
Bill Foey was with his friends Alex and Kenny when the moose started to close in.
I was moving pretty fast. I mean, I was on both edges of my snowboard moving with that moose.
And at one point, he says the bull bolted for Kenny.
Go, Ken! Go faster!
Others calling out to warn him.
Go faster!
The skiers weaving downhill to avoid a dangerous collision, the moose eventually veering off, and Bill still in disbelief.
In the moment, more surprised, knowing that those types of animals can be very aggressive, especially out in the wild.
Experts say these animals, which can weigh up to 1,500 pounds and stand about 7 feet tall, are extremely territorial. When charging, they can reach speeds up to 35 miles per hour.
It can be scary, it can feel dangerous, it can feel threatening and aggressive, but usually moose are reacting defensively to the situation that they're in. And again, it's not uncommon in areas where you have people recreating, especially even in big groups in these areas, that moose are spending the whole winter in and getting their food there.
So listen up, if you find yourself face to face with the moose, experts say the best thing to do is give them space. 25 yards, that's about 2 school buses worth of distance. Now, if they're charging at you, hide behind a tree or something solid, and if it knocks you down, curl into a ball and protect your head. Diane?
Give them space are instructions I don't think I needed, Morgan, but I appreciate it nonetheless. No, thank you. And a large part of the country might be questioning if it is still winter today. Record heat is starting to settle in from Minneapolis to New York. ABC News Chief Meteorologist Ginger Z is tracking it all for us. Ginger?
Diane, it is all about the warmth. We have had such a dud of a winter in most of the Great Lakes. In fact, the Twin Cities are still on track to have their warmest winter on record. And the last couple days have certainly helped. These records fell. Traverse City, Michigan, 50 on Wednesday. Wausau, Wisconsin was 47. Green Bay was 46. Wow, they have very low ice on the Great Lakes, you can imagine, too. Record high temperatures today, all the way from Des Moines to Binghamton, possible. Going to 64 in Des Moines. So it's been this ridge, right, that's been in place, but now it's starting to slide east a little. So we are going to move some of that near record warmth, if not breaking records, to New York City, which would be up low 60s. Boston, if they get to 60, that's a record. Detroit should do it on Friday at 60, and Indianapolis too. So this is weather, but we have seen a trend in the Great Lakes for warmer than average, if not the warmest winter on record. And then when you look at the whole globe, January 2024 was the warmest January on record. With paleoclimatology, we know those records can go back at least 100,000 years. And this is the 8th month in a row that the Earth has had their hottest month on record. Diane?
ABC News Chief Meteorologist Ginger Z, thank you. And it's time now for our weekly segment, Ask Alexis, where business reporter Alexis Christoforous shares financial advice on topics that matter most to you. And today she's here to answer your questions on Parent Plus loan forgiveness and electric vehicle tax breaks. All right, Alexis, let's start with Jim from New Jersey. Jim asks, my wife and I are near retirement age, but still struggling to pay off our Parent Plus loans that we took out for our twin sons' college education nearly 30 years ago. Is there loan forgiveness for Parent Plus loans?
Well, Jim, I want to thank you for this question because a growing number of parents are finding themselves in the exact situation, unable to finance their own retirement because they are saddled with student loans from their kids. So here's the good news. You can access the government's income contingent repayment plan if you consolidate your Parent Plus loan or loans into a direct consolidation loan. They're going to work with you to lower that monthly payment. And if you're still making those payments after 25 years, which in the case of Jim, that might be, the remaining balance is then forgiven. You may also want to consider refinancing that Parent Plus loan. If you have good credit, you might qualify for a more favorable interest rate with a private loan, because the current Parent Plus loan rate right now is a little over 8%. And depending on your adult children's financial situation, it's okay to ask them to chip in to offset that cost. I mean, if your twins each kicked in just $50 a month, that's $100 less that you and your wife need to contribute to paying off their college education.
All right, so let's go to Mary Jane from Virginia, Alexis. Mary Jane wants to know, I'm planning to buy my first electric car this year and would like to know if I'm eligible for any tax breaks.
This is the year after year, this is the question. There are so many changes to the tax code. So new this year, you can choose between claiming a non-refundable credit on your tax return or transferring that credit to the dealership to lower the price of the car at the time you make the purchase. Now, the challenge this year and really going forward is going to be that fewer electric cars are qualifying for those tax breaks because battery manufacturing restrictions have gotten so much tougher. So you can log on to fueleconomy.gov for up-to-date information on eligible models. And depending on things like your income, the price of the car, the make and model, new EVs may be eligible for a $7,500 tax credit, while used electric vehicles may qualify for up to $4,000 in tax breaks. And also, here's an idea. Check if your state offers credits or rebates on top of those federal tax breaks. Those can add up. But in Mary Jane state of Virginia, eligible residents may be able to get credits and rebates totaling $4,500 for qualifying EVs. You just want to make sure you're able to double dip and claim both the state and federal tax breaks. Diane?
All right, Alexis Christoforous, thank you. Coming up, rebuilding 6 months later, how residents of Maui are working to restore the island after last year's devastating wildfires. And stay with ABC News Live as the Supreme Court hears arguments on whether former President Trump can be banned from the 2024 ballot. We'll listen to those arguments live as they happen.
This is ABC News Live.
The crush of families here in Poland.
At refugee centers.
In Putin's Russia.
On the ground in Ukraine.
Close to the front line.
From the capital. Destructive Cat 4 storm.
We're along I-5.
Boston is in the bullseye.
Let's go.
ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news. Anytime, anywhere. Streaming 24/7, straight to you for free.
Thank you for making ABC News Live America's #1 streaming news.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir, America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television. From America's #1 news comes the all-new ABC News app. Breaking news, incredible video, faster, smarter, and customizable to your interests. If you love being in the know, you're gonna love this. Experience the all-new ABC News app. Download it now.
Wherever news breaks, it's so important to always remember that lives are changed. Getting you behind the stories as they happen. ABC News Live Prime. We'll take you there.
Streaming free on ABC News Live.
Inside that pen is a slice of human brain.
I've never seen a place like this in my life.
Oh my God, look!
Wow.
Reporting from the auto workers picket lines in Michigan, I'm Faith Abube. Wherever the story is, we'll take you there. You're streaming ABC News Live.
Welcome back. 6 months since the deadly wildfires in Maui, we're taking a closer look at how the area is rebuilding. The historic district of Lahaina suffered more than $5.5 billion in damage, and more than 2,000 households are still displaced. ABC's Melissa Dunn has the latest from Maui.
It was just 6 months ago when a massive inferno ravaged the historic district of Lahaina, which was once the capital of the Hawaiian Kingdom, as well as a national historical landmark.
Yeah, he gotta go.
At least 100 died, 3 still missing, over $5.5 billion in damage, and more than 2,000 households remain displaced in one of Hawaii's worst disasters on record.
About no later than 4 a.m. is when I begin my day. I have a rule, and I don't leave the office until every voicemail email has been dealt with.
Insurance executive Mahialani Strong is a Lahaina native and on the front line of the work to rebuild.
There's a lot of people that underbought insurance because they didn't plan for something like this to happen.
She says the process of filing out a claim is a challenge.
Imagine living in a home for 20 years and having to inventory everything you had in that home in order to collect your check.
As of last December, more than 3,900 homeowners have filed insurance claims in the Maui fire, with nearly 1,600 of those properties suffering a total loss. Roughly 30% of claim money has not been paid, equal to more than $456 million.
I think some of my biggest frustrations are fighting for what I believe they should be getting and getting a kickback or having to wait till it goes through a process.
But with so much about the future still so uncertain, the community taking comfort in the past, leaning on traditions and ancient wisdoms.
I have a short little Hawaiian proverb that goes like this: Heonu no kiola ina pono no kako. And what that simply means is life is delicious when you are in the right place at the right time for all the right reasons.
Hawaiian cultural leader Wilmont Kahaiali calling on ancestors for support and guidance in this E Alae ceremony.
The ceremony itself takes people to the water's edge, and they go into that water and come out having a whole new experience, almost like being born anew and having a new lease on life.
And in that newness, hope.
And so ho'omaka is to see the beginning. So when you're a navigator, you have to see the beginning of the horizon and know that you're going to chart a course to reach your destination.
ABC's Melissa Adan, thank you. And thank you for streaming with us. I'm Diane Macedo. ABC News Live is here for you anytime with the latest news, context, and analysis.
This is ABC News Live.
The crush of families here in Poland.
At refugee centers
In Putin's Russia.
on the ground in Ukraine.
Close to the front line.
From the capital.
Destructive Cat 4 storm.
You're along I-5.
Boston is in the bullseye.
Let's go.
ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news. Anytime, anywhere. Streaming 24/7, straight to you for free.
Thank you for making ABC News Live America's #1 streaming news.
Y'all tuning in for Taylor Swift. You're going to be tuning in for Usher, too.
You're going to do it big. Oh, my God. They say Oscar, Tony, Grammy, Emmy. You should put Super Bowl on there, too.
Baby, let me love you. Usher Raymond is going to get shirtless. I don't think it'll break any FCC violations. Go shirtless.
Hey, man, that's what I do. It's Usher, baby.
Yeah! Usher, My Way to the Super Bowl. This is Impact by Nightline, now streaming on Hulu. Why do so many people start their day here?
From ABC News, this is Start Here.
To be in the know and get a different take on the day's top stories.
A lot of news today, so let's get into it.
Listen now to the Daily News Podcast honored with 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards and see why the New York Times calls it a news podcast worth listening to. Start Here, ABC News. Make it your daily first listen.
Now, that's a part of the story I bet you didn't see coming.
Wherever you get your podcasts, Start Here.
Whenever, wherever news breaks, it's so important to always remember that lives are changed. Here in London, in Buffalo, Uvalde, Texas, Edinburgh, Scotland. Reporting from Rolling Fork, Mississippi. Ukrainian refugees here in Warsaw. We're heading to a small community outside of Mexico City. Getting you behind the stories as they happen. ABC News Live Prime. We'll take you there.
Stream ABC News Live weeknights wherever you stream your news. Only on ABC News Live. From America's #1 news source comes the all-new ABC News app. Breaking news, incredible video, faster, smarter, and it can customize to you and your interests. If you love being in the know, you're gonna love this. Experience what all the buzz is about. Experience the all-new ABC News app. Download it now. ABC News, America's #1 news source.
We're gonna walk down, and I'll be there with you. We're gonna walk down. We're going to walk down anyone you want, but I think right here we're going to walk down to the Capitol. And we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women. And we're probably not going to be cheering so much for some of them. Because you'll never take back our country with weakness. You have to show strength, and you have to be strong. We have come to demand that Congress do the right thing and only count the electors who have been lawfully slated. Lawfully slated. I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
That was then President Trump speaking at the Ellipse on January 6th, just a few minutes before rioters broke through the first barriers at the Capitol. I'm Diane Macedo. Thanks for joining us. This morning, the Supreme Court is set to hear arguments on whether former President Trump should be blocked from running for president due to his actions surrounding January 6th. This after Colorado removed him from the state's ballot, citing the 14th Amendment, which bars anyone who's taken the oath of office and engaged in insurrection from being able to hold office again. The decision could have ramifications far beyond Colorado, and those arguments are set to begin within the hour. We will bring that to you live as it happens. Meanwhile, 2 Kentucky moms are demanding justice after they say they were drugged and attacked while on vacation in the Bahamas. They say they didn't take drinks from strangers, they weren't drinking in excess, and they thought they were doing all the right things to be safe. GMA3 anchor Eva Pilgrim has the details.
Amber Shearer and Dengalia Dobson were on their first kids-free vacation on board a Carnival cruise.
We've been best friends for over 20 years, and we decided we were going to make this our girls' trip.
On the last day of their trip, they stopped at a local resort on Grand Bahama Island, a resort they say the cruise ship recommended. Once there, the mothers claim they were offered a 2-for-1 drink, which they accepted, but immediately fell ill.
After the first drink, we had to get out of the ocean because we noticed that it was just hitting so hard. I just felt so out of it.
Shearer and Dobson say they lost consciousness and allege that after drinking the drugged cocktails, members of the resort staff sexually assaulted them.
I vaguely remember glimpses of his face. I don't remember all of it. I don't remember everything, but I remembered enough of that he was a staff worker and he had a goatee and he was a local, that the resort security were able to go pull the footage and identify them right then and there.
They say there were bruises on their legs and that they tested positive for various drugs. The Royal Bahamas Police posting on Facebook confirming 2 men were arrested for sexual assault of 2 women and that an investigation is underway. Shearer and Dobson say that's not enough. They're back in the U.S. demanding justice. The State Department issued a level 2 travel advisory for the Bahamas in late January due to an increase in homicides and sexual violence.
It's extremely important if you're going to go overseas to look on the State Department website as to what they say about crime. What security level is it?
An attorney for the women says the cruise ship bears some responsibility.
Carnival has an obligation to warn about dangerous conditions that they know about or they should know about. And they also have an obligation to make sure that the areas that they're recommending to passengers, to tourists, are safe.
Carnival Cruise responding to the incident, saying in a statement, while ashore in Freeport, Bahamas on an independent shore excursion, 2 guests on Carnival Elation reported to Bahamian police that they were sexually assaulted at a local beach. Our onboard care team provided support for the 2 guests as they sailed back to Jacksonville. Bahamian police are investigating the matter and Carnival is providing our full cooperation.
So what can you do? These 2 telling us while they thought being with one other friend was enough, they're reconsidering that now. Their advice to other women, stick to groups of 4 or more when traveling. Diane?
GMA3 anchor Eva Pilgrim, thank you. And an airline is now asking to weigh passengers along with their baggage. Finnair says it's looking to collect the data for safety reasons, and it's not the only airline doing it. Still, many social media users say they are horrified at the move. ABC News transportation correspondent Gio Benitez has more on why it's happening.
The Scandinavian airline Finnair inviting passengers to be weighed in along with their carry-on baggage. The airline says the goal is to collect anonymous data on average weight of passengers with their hand luggage for the purpose of aircraft balance and performance calculations that are needed for the safe operation of flights. So far, 600 passengers have volunteered for the survey.
Airlines use an average for male and for female and for summer and for winter, and you need to correct those every now and then, especially if the population has gotten a bit more pudgy.
It turns out the airline has been doing this since 2018, and it's completely voluntary. It's not uncommon for some international airlines to do weight surveys every few years, required by their governing bodies.
Every 5 years, you figure the population changes a little in weight, and that's why these tests are needed.
And Finnair is not alone. Air New Zealand weighed more than 10,000 passengers last June. Air New Zealand calling the survey essential to the safe and efficient operation of the aircraft, and that the pilot needs to know the weight and balance of a loaded plane before takeoff. And Korean Air did it in the fall, saying collecting this data was crucial for the safety of flight operations.
And again, this is completely voluntary. Nobody is being forced to step on a scale, but when this happens, it certainly triggers a lot of good questions, possibly even some anxiety from so many people, Diane.
ABC News transportation correspondent Gio Benitez, thank you. And NASA is launching a tool that could help scientists better understand climate change. January was the 8th consecutive warmest month globally on record, and temperatures across a majority of the world's oceans also hit unprecedented levels. ABC News chief meteorologist and chief climate correspondent Ginger Z joins me now with how NASA's trying to find out why. Ginger, so what did NASA officials tell you about this tool and how they're using the data it's collecting?
Right, so I made a call yesterday, Diane, because we got the new information in January, hottest January on record, 8th month in a row, and it felt like we just kept repeating the same thing, but we really haven't honed in on the why. A lot of people will talk about the different variables, which we will get to, but one of them is aerosols, meaning the particles in the air. And so what they did last night, NASA launched a satellite, and that satellite, called PACE, is not only going to be looking at the ocean and the plankton and how they kind of interact with carbon, but for this part, what's important, it'll be looking at aerosols, what type they are, meaning the type that come from shipping, say, that has greatly reduced in the last couple of years, or the type that come from dust or sea spray. And they'll be able to figure out how those are interacting with our planet, because sulfur dioxide, the thing that comes out of a lot of the fossil fuels that we burn, that actually reflects light. And so that, as we've reduced and made our air pollution better, has allowed more sunlight in, allowing us to heat more. So anyway, this rocket is going to help, or I'm sorry, the satellite is going to help to determine that variable of aerosols and how much that has to do with the heat. And if you look at the record heat, right, January now officially from Copernicus, the warmest January on record, it really is quite insane to see the whole picture of how far above average, like how far above the last record this year has been. And so the NASA scientist, Gavin Schmidt, who I spoke with, he said, NASA, we like puzzles, but we like to solve puzzles. And that's what they're going to be working on with PACE, the satellite.
And Ginger, aerosols aren't the only variable NASA's working on to understand this record-breaking global heat. So what else are they looking at here?
You've probably heard a lot of people say, yeah, but it's El Nino. And they're correct. El Nino peaked right now. Like, we just peaked. And we're going, and you see the Pacific Ocean. Remember, El Nino means the Pacific Ocean has abnormally warm temperatures. However, remember this whole heating thing started last summer, before we even had El Nino. So that made a lot of scientists kind of perk up and say, wait, that has nothing to do with El Nino yet. Now we expect, after a peak of El Nino, like right now, the spring should be warmer than average. And that's where we should be seeing the anomaly. That said, El Nino is not the only variable. A lot of people will talk about the Hunga Tonga eruption, the volcano. And did that have an effect? Because it put a bunch of things in the stratosphere. And a lot of the scientists are saying that they think that's relatively negligible or almost cancels itself out with the sulfur in the water. Anyway, they need to figure out which variable it is, and hopefully this PACE satellite is going to help them do that.
All right, Chief Meteorologist and Climate Correspondent Ginger Zee. So interesting, Ginger. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, Prince William is speaking out about King Charles's and Princess Kate's recoveries, the thanks he's giving, and what we know about Prince Harry's quick return to the U.S. Also ahead, exploring Black history that isn't taught. We're speaking with an award-winning professor about the lesser-known moments in U.S. history and why it's important for America to know its roots. And stay with ABC News Live as the Supreme Court hears arguments on whether former President Trump can be banned from the 2024 ballot. We'll listen to those arguments live when they happen.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir, America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television.
Get ready, America, every Friday.
The hottest trends, styles, and must-have. What's the right stuff to buy right now? I really love that. It's time to buy the right stuff.
Yes!
And save big time, too.
The right stuff.
Fridays on GMA. You're going to love it. This is ABC News Live.
The crush of families here in Poland.
At refugee centers.
In Putin's Russia.
On the ground in Ukraine.
Close to the front line.
From the capital. Destructive Cat 4 storm.
You're along I-5.
Boston is in the bullseye. Let's go.
ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news. Anytime, anywhere. Streaming 24/7, straight to you for free.
Thank you for making ABC News Live America's #1 streaming news.
From America's #1 news source comes the all-new ABC News app. Breaking news, incredible video, faster, smarter, and it can customize to you and your interests. If you love being in the know, you're gonna love this. Experience what all the buzz is about. Experience the all-new ABC News app. Download it now. ABC News Live Prime, winner of the Gracie Award for Best News Program in all of television. Stream ABC News Live Prime with Linsey Davis, weeknights on ABC News Live.
Y'all tuning in for Taylor Swift. You're going to be tuning in for Usher, too.
You're going to do it big. Oh, my God. They say Oscar, Tony, Grammy, Emmy. You should put Super Bowl on there, too.
Baby, let me love you. Usher Raymond is going to get shirtless. I don't think it'll break any FCC violations. Go shirtless.
Hey, man, that's what I do. It's Usher, baby.
Yeah!
Usher, my way to the Super Bowl. This is Impact by Nightline, now streaming on Hulu.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, Prince William is speaking out for the first time about his father, King Charles's cancer diagnosis. The king has been performing some royal duties, but the prince is taking on more responsibilities. ABC News foreign correspondent Maggie Rulli has the latest.
Prince William stepping out and stepping up.
Your Royal Highness.
The heir to the throne publicly addressing for the first time the health scares that have rocked the royal family.
I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you also for the kind messages of support for Catherine and for my father, especially in recent days. It means a great deal to us all.
The prince also making headlines with none other than Tom Cruise, in attendance as a supporter of the Air Ambulance charity.
And Tom, if you wouldn't mind not borrowing either of the new helicopters for the next Mission Impossible, it would be appreciated.
As King Charles recovers from his cancer treatment and Princess Kate recovers from abdominal surgery, William is left holding the royal reins.
He's dealing with a lot personally, but he still managed to really put the focus on the charity. He even made a joke, and he really sent that message of kind of getting on with the job.
Meanwhile, his younger brother, Prince Harry, is back in Los Angeles after a 24-hour trip to London, which included a short meeting with his father, but no meeting with his brother.
We were told that William had no plans to see Harry while he was here, and I think the fact that that was made clear underlines just how deep those hostilities still are.
And Diane, the king is still in Sandringham, but he has been able to keep up with some of his royal duties and even held his weekly audience with the Prime Minister last night by phone. He also has made a point, Diane, to say that he wants his cancer diagnosis to raise awareness. And now we're seeing the royal family use their Instagram account to post advice and tips to help people who are coping with the diagnosis, even posting to local charities. Diane already starting to make an impact.
All right, ABC News foreign correspondent Maggie Rulli, thank you. And Dartmouth says it will once again require SAT and ACT scores for admission after suspending the standardized exams because of the pandemic. A new study by the university found test scores could have helped less advantaged students gain access to the Ivy League school. But the move's raising questions about what's to come from other colleges and what it all means for students. I want to bring in ABC's Brad Mielke, host of the Start Here podcast, for more. Brad, let's rewind here for a second, because during the pandemic, the College Board had to cancel several test rounds of these tests, and so colleges stopped requiring them. And then post-pandemic, a lot of them have made these test scores optional. So how's that been working?
Yeah, this was sort of framed as a pandemic move to, you didn't know whether kids were taking them in a room with each other or whatever, so a lot of schools were like, you can just make the test optional, don't worry about it. Some schools, though, went even further, and they said, this is such a great lowering of a barrier. So many students, who don't have expensive tutors, never were applying to these schools anyway, and now they can't, now that this sort of barrier to entry is removed, they actually saw applications go up at schools like Dartmouth and some of these Ivy League schools. And so other schools around the country, the UC system, no longer even has spots for the SAT scores. They don't consider it as part of their application process. So that's how much this movement has kind of taken fire based on what was a pandemic change that is now more or less common at a lot of schools, except Dartmouth says, actually, we'd like to go back, please.
So what's the takeaway here for students, and what does this do for the debate of whether standardized tests favor privileged students or not?
Well, it's a big debate, and it's been a big debate because there is this question about, is the SAT does it help you distinguish between students, or is it just a barrier of entry that keeps certain students out the door who are not applying to your school in the first place? Dartmouth put together the study, and they said, actually, we noticed that a lot of students were withholding their SAT scores. It's optional now. You don't have to put them, and a lot of students weren't. And they would have helped those students had they put their SAT scores in. They thought they weren't good enough. Dartmouth is like, they were good enough. This would have been an extra sort of feather in your cap. You would have gotten in. Instead, we find ourselves admitting more, like a less diverse student population because we're not seeing the scores. However, I talked to an expert at the University of Washington who basically said, this leaves out a key part of the story here, which is that Dartmouth's applications skyrocketed. They went from 20,000 to 30,000 applicants. What that tells you, he says, is it's not that if you require SAT scores from all these kids that suddenly now, yes, you'll see all their scores. Now you can compare them more accurately. It's that you just won't have as many students applying. That's what it tells you, is that these students, once they saw that barrier reduced and were like, oh, I don't have to bring my SAT score in here? Great, I'll actually apply. A lot of people are concerned that those students will now sort of go back into hiding, as it were.
Interesting. And before you go, I want to ask you about this Target controversy, because a history teacher went on TikTok to point out some errors on a product that had civil rights leaders on it. Talk to me about this.
So Target unveiled this product that was made by a publisher. You know, like Target buys lots of products and they put them on the shelves. This was sort of a sticker magnet set celebrating Black history and the icons of Black history throughout the years. Carter G. Woodson, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington. This teacher realizes a lot of the names are next to the wrong pictures for these people. Apparently this had not gone through enough checks.
No, yeah, the quality control didn't quite.
And this is the thing, and if you know these faces and these names at all, like W.E.B. Du Bois rocks a really cool mustache, right? That's not next to Booker, and like Booker T. Washington, like cutting, striking figure. These are not difficult people to tell apart, and yet, for someone who put out this sticker set, it was. And so this history teacher, her post went viral, and Target has removed it from the shelves, saying they've told the publisher that the errors were there.
Wow. All right, ABC's Brad Mielke, thank you. And to hear Brad dive into more stories like these, check out the Start Here podcast. New episodes drop every weekday morning at 6 Eastern, wherever you get your podcasts. A recent poll finds only 27% of Americans say the U.S. history they were taught in school reflected a full and accurate account of the role of African Americans. The Quinnipiac University poll also shows 66% say what they learned fell short. So as we celebrate Black History Month, we want to take some time to discuss the lesser-known moments in American history, often not taught in school. Assistant professor at NYU's Journalism Institute and co-host of the podcast Uncivil, Chenjerai Kumanyika joins me now for more on this. Professor, thanks so much for coming on. Such an important topic. And I wanted to get first your reaction to these poll results. 2/3 of Americans here are saying they weren't taught enough about the struggles and the triumphs of African Americans in the U.S. Why do you think that is? Why isn't this being taught?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. And, you know, I got to say, I'm not surprised to see those answers, even though they are alarming, because when I made Uncivil and another podcast that I work on, Seen on Radio, these deal with difficult moments in history. And I worried that maybe some Americans would feel disturbed. But the overwhelming feedback we got was people saying, we want more of this. Why didn't I learn this in school? And they actually feel really happy to have a correct history, even if it's challenging and challenges what they thought they knew.
Now, you say this isn't just omission, but that there's a history of telling a false mythological history of our country. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, you know, I think that many people over the years have understood that, you know, a lot of the, leaders, politicians, people who had particular kinds of political stakes have understood that when people learn real history, it affects how they function in the world. So if you understand the history of human rights violations and war crimes, you will accurately conclude that the U.S. is currently committing war crimes just as the ICJ did. If you learn about the history of voting rights suppression, you will learn that maybe you don't want to, it's important to protect voting rights and all kinds of other things. So people realize that history factors in to how people show up and how they struggle. And so there's a history of banning that. You could go back to Uncle Tom's Cabin. This was a powerful abolitionist book that sort of, laid out what slavery was really all about. And people tried to ban it. Why would you want to ban an accurate history and account of what was actually going on?
Now, there's been a wave of laws implemented in recent years that restrict certain lessons on race in classrooms across the country. What do you make of the debate surrounding that? And can you quickly also touch on a few stories that aren't being taught in the classroom that you think people need to know?
Well, I think that, if we're going to solve the problems that are going to confront us right now, and we have many difficult problems, we have to have an accurate account of how we got to this moment. And I also know that people want to feel inspired, right? They want to, by the most, compelling moments, the moments where people were courageous, the moments where people didn't do what was convenient. And there's so many examples in history. I often talk about the story of someone like Robert Smalls, but I think even if you think about the civil rights movement, we talk about Martin Luther King, but there was a powerful role that Black women played in that Montgomery bus boycott and in the civil rights movement in general. I think with so many people talking about unions and trying to look at their working conditions, the history of labor, which has, which involves both Black people. I think about Drum and the auto workers, union there. I mean, there's so many powerful moments that people don't know enough about. Or Freedom Summer, right? You talk about the whole struggle of Freedom Summer. And these are histories that brought people together across racial lines to struggle to dismantle the power that was oppressing people, right? So I think in that regard, it's just real history. It's real factual history. I'm fine with calling it Black history, but if you don't know that Black history, then you don't know the real history. And thankfully, a lot of Americans are really excited to get it.
All right, Assistant Professor at NYU's Journalism Institute, Chenjerai Kumnaniko. We so appreciate your time today, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you.
Coming up, just 3 days until Super Bowl Sunday, how Vegas is preparing for the hundreds of thousands of visitors and what Travis Kelce is saying about the Chiefs becoming a dynasty. And stay with ABC News Live as the Supreme Court hears arguments on whether former President Trump can be banned from the 2024 ballot. We'll listen to those arguments live when they happen.
This is ABC News Live.
The crush of families here in Poland.
At refugee centers
In Putin's Russia.
On the ground in Ukraine.
Close to the front line.
From the capital. Destructive Cat 4 storm.
Here along I-5.
Boston is in the bullseye.
Let's go.
ABC News Live, America's #1 streaming news. Anytime, anywhere. Streaming 24/7, straight to you for free.
Thank you for making ABC News Live America's #1 streaming news.
All right, here we go. You ready? Let's do it.
Yes, it's the show America wants and America needs right now.
This is What Would You Do? Let's go. How are you? Yes.
So what will you be watching Saturdays on ABC News Live?
What would you do?
Hey, I guess I just found out.
The What Would You Do Marathon, 2 to 6 Eastern, every Saturday on ABC News Live.
My favorite show.
With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir, America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television.
Inside that pen is a slice of human brain.
I've never seen a place like this in my life.
Oh my God, look!
Wow.
Reporting from the U.S.-Mexico border in California, I'm Jacqueline Lee. Wherever the story is, we'll take you there. You're streaming ABC News Live.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. Excitement is growing across the country for this weekend's Super Bowl. Las Vegas has been beefing up security for the big game, and Will Reeve is there in Vegas with more on what's being done to keep people safe.
Super Bowl 58 is just 3 days away. 330,000 people are expected to descend on Las Vegas this weekend, and security is tight.
There are no known, credible, specific threats to the Super Bowl or to Las Vegas at this time. But we are vigilant and we are prepared.
30 federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies are tasked with keeping the city and the game safe.
I would just say to you that no city is better prepared.
An unexpected security risk presenting itself in broad daylight yesterday. This man seen climbing 366 feet to the top of Las Vegas's sparkling new attraction, the Sphere. The incident disrupting traffic. The man was detained.
We know that people are going to test us. We know people are going to try things. As we sit here today, there's an individual for a publicity stunt that just are climbing up the top of the Sphere. Your first responders are all over there. We're taking care of it.
As for the game, it can't come soon enough for anyone, particularly the players.
Obviously, we have the media and stuff like that you have to do, but at the same time, it's a normal week now. We're going to get back to practice and do what we would do for a normal game day.
The Chiefs have a chance to make their mark on history as the first team to repeat in 19 years.
I think 3 is a lucky number. 1 is anybody can be one and done. I think 2 is special, but 3 is when you solidify yourself as a dynasty for sure.
This is Pitt. The 49ers seeking to avenge their 2020 Super Bowl loss to Kansas City.
Touchdown, San Francisco.
And bring the Super Bowl home to the Bay Area for the first time since 1995.
At the end of the day, man, like this is something that we've all dreamed of growing up, and got to be grateful for it and have fun with it.
Our thanks to Will Reeve. And here's some of the top headlines we're watching right now. The military says the 5 Marines who went missing in Southern California are confirmed dead. That ends a 2-day search and rescue operation that started when their helicopter was reported overdue after not arriving near San Diego. The Super Stallion was discovered early Wednesday morning after rescue crews were delayed due to poor weather conditions. The identities of those fallen Marines have not yet been released. Central Command says the U.S. carried out an airstrike in Baghdad targeting a senior leader of an Iranian-backed militia in Iraq. The U.S. official told ABC News the airstrike was part of the retaliatory actions following the deadly attack on the Tower 22 base in Jordan that killed 3 American soldiers. A Hezbollah paramilitary group has released a statement vowing to respond at the, quote, appropriate time and place. The Icelandic Coast Guard says a volcano has erupted in Iceland for the 3rd time in 2 months, sending lava jets as high as 250 feet into the air. This one hit in the southwestern part of the country near the town of Grindavik, where homes had been destroyed from the flow of lava during a previous eruption. Local officials say the lava flow appears to be slightly less than in those past eruptions. Thanks for streaming with us. I'm Diane Macedo. ABC News Live is here for you anytime with the latest news, context, and analysis. We'll be right back.
Y'all tuning in for Taylor Swift. You're going to be tuning in for Usher, too.
You're going to do it big. Oh, my God. They say Oscar, Tony, Grammy, Emmy. You should put Super Bowl on there, too. Baby, let me love you.
Usher Raymond is going to get shirtless. I don't think it'll break any FCC violations. Go shirtless.
Hey, man, that's what I do. It's Usher, baby. Yeah!
Usher, my way to the Super Bowl. This is Impact by Nightline, now streaming on Hulu. With so much at stake, so much on the line, more Americans turn here than any other newscast. ABC News World News Tonight with David Muir, America's #1 most watched newscast across all of television. From America's #1 news comes the all-new ABC News app. Breaking news, incredible video, faster, smarter, and customizable to your interests. If you love being in the know, you're gonna love this. Experience the all-new ABC News app. Download it now. More Americans choose ABC News, America's #1 news source. Why do so many people start their day here?
From ABC News, this is Start Here.
To be in the know and get a different take on the day's top stories.
A lot of news today, so let's get into it.
Listen now to the Daily News Podcast honored with 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards and see why the New York Times calls it a news podcast worth listening to. Start Here, ABC News. Make it your daily first listen.
Now, that's a part of the story I bet you didn't see coming.
Wherever you get your podcasts, Start Here.
First thing in the morning.
There's a lot going on.
Yet another avalanche warning that's up.
To catch you up with what happened overnight. A dangerous ice storm is impacting the morning commute.
What's happening today? Escalating tensions in the Middle East.
What people are talking about. The migrant crisis.
Fast, straightforward.
With some fun in between.
How does billionaire sound?
Sounds good to me. The moose started chasing a dog.
First thing in the morning.
America This Morning.
America's #1 early morning news.
On ABC News Live.
Whenever, wherever news breaks, it's so important to always remember that lives are changed. Here in London, in Buffalo, Uvalde, Texas, Edinburgh, Scotland. Reporting from Rolling Fork, Mississippi. Ukrainian refugees here in Warsaw. We're heading to a small community outside of Mexico City. Getting you behind the stories as they happen. ABC News Live Prime. We'll take you there.
Stream ABC News Live weeknights wherever you stream your news. Only on ABC News Live.
I'm Linsey Davis reporting from Rolling Fork, Mississippi. Wherever the story is, we'll take you there. You're streaming ABC News Live.
Hi, I'm Diane Macedo. Let's get right to our top story. The Supreme Court is set to hear arguments over whether former President Trump can be blocked from the ballot for his role in January 6th. The 14th Amendment bars anyone who's previously taken the oath of office from holding office again if they've engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution. A watchdog group representing voters in Colorado sued, alleging Trump's actions surrounding the attack on the Capitol breached that clause, and the Colorado Supreme Court agreed, removing Trump from the state's ballot. Similar efforts have also unfolded in more than a dozen states, with 2 blocking Trump from their ballots and others allowing him to stay on. Now the U.S. Supreme Court could decide once and for all whether the former president is eligible for re-election. Senior national correspondent Terry Moran joins me outside the Supreme Court now, along with ABC News executive editorial producer John Santucci and ABC News Supreme Court contributor Kate Shaw for more. John, let's start with the stakes here. How significant is this, and what is at stake for the former president in this case?
Well, listen, the reality is if Donald Trump is thrown off the ballot in one state, could it be something that gets repeated in other states? And you mentioned right there at the top, 34 other states have had situations like this, that voters, party officials, others have filed efforts to get Donald Trump off the ballot, haven't been successful outside of Colorado or Maine at the moment. And Colorado is the first test case that is gotten to the Supreme Court at this magnitude. We haven't had a case like this, Diane, since Bush versus Gore in 2000's election. So to think that Donald Trump's possibility of being thrown off a ballot is going to go before a Supreme Court, which we should remind our viewers, 3 of those 9 judges were appointed by Donald Trump. So in a world that his judges, as Donald Trump refers to them, could be judging whether or not he's on the ballot or not, it's historic.
Terry, you covered the Supreme Court's pivotal Bush v. Gore decision in 2000. How do you think this compares to that?
It's very, very different in several ways. Well, one, there were off-ramps for the Supreme Court in Bush versus Gore. They did not have to decide that case and that presidential election awarding victory to George W. Bush. There were still votes being counted. There was a federal law that was designed to take care of conflicts and arguments over the exact thing that was happening in Florida. But the Supreme Court felt that because of the timeline and their own sense of judicial supremacy, that they had to decide that case. It really injured the court's standing with the public. And in this case, there's no off-ramp. It's up to them. They have to decide this case regarding Donald Trump. The other thing, it was a more innocent time. One cannot imagine the court stepping in and doing something like that today, after January 6th, after all this country has been through. It was a very different time and a very different case.
Kate, what will the justices have to consider here? And will they need to determine whether Trump engaged in insurrection in order to rule?
There are, at least a dozen distinct legal questions that the court could discuss today, answer in the opinion it finally issues. Is the presidency even an office under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? Did Trump previously take an oath? Is the presidential oath different from other kinds of oaths officials take? And critically, Diane, the question you ask, was January 6th or Donald Trump's involvement in January 6th an insurrection? Those are 3 of the many questions the court, I think, will grapple with. Another is whether this part of the Constitution requires Congress to pass a statute to actually implement it, or whether it has force on its own. And the way this case is set up, the challengers, the ones who are trying to keep Trump off the ballot, essentially need to win each and every one of these distinct legal questions. If Trump wins one, he very likely will prevail, and the court will reverse the Colorado Supreme Court, meaning he can appear on the Colorado ballot. Depending on how they write the opinion, that might not resolve the question for the rest of this year and for all time. It might be narrow, but it's a case going in that the advantage is certainly with Trump given the number of legal questions, and yet I think there's a very strong argument and a pretty broad agreement, though not unanimity among historians and scholars, that the argument for keeping Trump off the ballot is a very strong one on the merits.
Terry, more than 1,200 people have been charged for their roles in the January 6th attack on the Capitol. Prosecutors have secured more than 800 convictions, including some for felony charges like assaulting police and even seditious conspiracy. So what have those cases found about whether the January 6th attack was an insurrection or just a riot, and how could that impact this case?
Diane, I think those statistics are going to have a big impact on this courtroom, and I expect Donald Trump's lawyers to raise them because of all those charges. 800 guilty pleas secured by Biden's Department of Justice, the special counsel, Jack Smith, within the Department of Justice. Not one person, including Donald Trump, has been charged with the federal crime of insurrection. They might find that relevant.
And John, former President Trump has downplayed the violence on January 6th. He's claimed his supporters posed zero threat. He calls those convicted of attacking the U.S. Capitol J6 hostages. Yep. Are those comments, could those comments come into play here in this case now?
100%, because listen, I mean, the reality is that what these voters, these 6 voters in Colorado have said, Diane, it's because of Donald Trump's actions and comments around January 6th that they felt compelled to bring this case. It was the argument that swayed the Colorado Supreme Court that Donald Trump should not be on the ballot because of those actions, because of those comments. And the reality is, Donald Trump, as you just noted, hasn't stopped. He has said those January 6 hostages, as he refers to them, he would pardon them should he get another turn in the Oval Office. So all of that plays into the conversation today, and you've got to imagine between the voters, the Solicitor General of Colorado, they are absolutely going to bring that up in that room today.
And Kate, the Colorado Supreme Court justices who dissented in that 4-3 ruling raised the issue of due process. One wrote that the case should be dismissed in the absence of an insurrection-related conviction. So how do you expect due process to come into play in today's arguments?
It's one of the other important legal questions in the case. Was the process afforded to Trump in the trial court in Colorado, which was where the evidence was taken and the decision was made that this really was insurrection for constitutional purposes? So was that process enough to comply with the Constitution's guarantees of due process? That's another way in which the Supreme Court might find in, a narrow sense that the Colorado Supreme Court was wrong. And that's one of the bases for ruling for Trump here that wouldn't resolve the question forever. Because if the court here says that wasn't enough process and maybe you need something more formal, maybe you need an actual conviction, there's nothing to stop a state from trying to do something more robust that might satisfy the demands of due process. Now, a criminal conviction, I think, is not something that could happen for insurrection, but a state could try again and to try to do more fact development. So that is another of the many legal issues that the case involves.
And Terry, Trump's attorneys are expected to argue that he was not engaged in insurrection. They're also expected to focus on some language in the 14th Amendment as to whether or not it actually applies to him. What are you listening for from Trump's side of this?
Well, I think you're right, Diane. Both of those arguments will be made. One of the reasons it seems that Special Counsel Jack Smith did not charge Donald Trump with insurrection is because the evidence that he participated in insurrection is in part his speech to the crowd out there on the mall in front of me. And that speech is First Amendment protected speech. He also included an admonition to the protesters to be peaceful in their actions. It's a tough case to make. There's that. And as for the question
under Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, the Colorado Supreme Court's decision is wrong.
Now let's listen
and should be reversed for numerous independent reasons. The first reason is that President Trump is not covered by Section 3 because the president is not an officer of the United States, as that term is used throughout the Constitution. Officer of the United States refers only to appointed officials, and it does not encompass elected individuals, such as the president or members of Congress. This is clear from the Commissions Clause, the Impeachment Clause, and the Appointments Clause, each of which uses officers of the United States to refer only to appointed and not elected officials. The second reason is that Section 3 cannot be used to exclude a presidential candidate from the ballot, even if that candidate is disqualified from serving as president under Section 3, because Congress can lift that disability after the candidate is elected, but before he takes office. A state cannot exclude any candidate for federal office from the ballot on account of Section 3, and any state that does so is violating the holding of term limits by altering the Constitution's qualifications for federal office. The Colorado Supreme Court's decision is no different from a state residency law that requires members of Congress to inhabit the state prior to Election Day, when the Constitution requires only that members of Congress inhabit the state that they represent when elected. In both situations, a state is accelerating the deadline to meet a constitutionally imposed qualification and is thereby violating the holding of term limits. And in this situation, a ruling from this court that affirms the decision below would not only violate term limits, but take away the votes of potentially tens of millions of Americans. I welcome the court's questions.
Mr. Mitchell, would you, you didn't spend much time on your argument with respect to whether or not Section 3 is self-executing. So would you address that? And in doing that, your argument is that it's not self-executing, but then in that case, what would the role of the state be? Or is it entirely up to Congress to implement the disqualification in Section 3?
It is entirely up to Congress, Justice Thomas, and our argument goes beyond actually saying that Section 3 is non-self-executing. We need to say something more than that, because a non-self-executing treaty or a non-self-executing constitutional provision normally can still be enforced by a state if it chooses to enact legislation. The holding of Griffin's case goes beyond even that by saying that a state is not allowed to implement or enforce Section 3 of the 14th Amendment unless and until Congress enacts implementing legislation allowing it to do so. So under Griffin's case, which we believe is correctly decided, the Anderson litigants disagree with us on that point, but if this court were to adhere to the holding of Griffin's case, there would not be any role for the states in enforcing Section 3 unless Congress were to enact a statute that gives them that authority.
Counsel, what if somebody came into a state Secretary of State's office and said, I took the oath specified in Section 3, I participated in an insurrection, and I want to be on the ballot. Does the Secretary of State have the authority in that situation to say, no, you're disqualified?
No, the Secretary of State could not do that consistent with term limits, because even if the candidate is an admitted insurrectionist, Section 3 still allows the candidate to run for office and even win election to office, and then see whether Congress lifts that disability after the election. This happened frequently in the wake of the 14th Amendment, where Confederate insurrectionists were elected to Congress, and sometimes they obtained a waiver, sometimes they did not, and each House would determine for itself whether to seat that elected insurrectionist, because each House is the sole judge of the qualifications of its members. So if a state banned even an admitted insurrectionist from the ballot, it would be adding to and altering the Constitution's qualifications for office, because under Section 3, the candidate need only qualify during the time the candidate holds the office to which he's been elected. And under Your Honor's hypothetical, the Secretary of State would be demanding, essentially, that the candidate obtain a waiver from Congress earlier than the candidate needs to obtain that waiver.
Well, even though it's pretty unlikely, or at least would be difficult for an individual who says, you know, I am an insurrectionist and I had taken the oath, that would require 2/3 of votes in Congress, right?
Correct.
Well, this is a pretty unlikely scenario.
It may be unlikely, but no Secretary of State is permitted to predict the likelihood of a waiver, because in doing so, they're adding a new qualification to the ability to run for Congress. And the proper analogy, Mr. Chief Justice, is to state residency laws, because the Constitution says that a member of Congress must inhabit the state that he represents when elected. And the lower courts have all held, in reliance on term limits, that a state election official cannot move that deadline any earlier by requiring the candidate for Congress to inhabit the state.
So even if somebody comes in and says, I'm a resident of the Secretary of State's office in Illinois, and says, I'm a resident of Indiana, I have been all my life, I want to run for office in Illinois, the Secretary of State can't say, no, you can't?
Well, the question would be, is that person going to inhabit the state when the election is held? So if the candidate makes clear, perhaps through a sworn declaration or through his own statements, that he has no intention of relocating to that state before Election Day, then the Secretary of State would be enforcing an extant constitutional qualification rather than enforcing a new state-imposed qualification. And that's the key under term limits. Is the state in any way altering the criteria for a federal office, either for Congress or for the presidency? And in this situation, the Colorado Supreme Court is going slightly beyond what Section 3 requires, because Section 3, on its face, bans an insurrectionist only from holding office.
Counsel, can I stop you a moment and back up a minute? You admitted that the concept of self-executing does generally permit states to provide a cause of action for breaches of a constitutional provision.
Correct.
In fact, they do it frequently for takings clauses. There's no debate that Colorado has provided that cause of action. You want to go a step further and say that this, like the treaty clause, requires implementing legislation to permit the state to disqualify an insurrectionist.
That's correct. So
under Section 3.
That's right.
So history proves a lot to me and to my colleagues generally. But there's a whole lot of examples of states relying on Section 3 to disqualify insurrectionists for state offices. And you're basically telling us that you want us to go 2 steps further. You want to, maybe 3. You want us to say that self-execution doesn't mean what it generally means. You want us now to say it means that Congress must permit states or require states to stop insurrectionists from taking state office. And so this is a complete preemption in a way that's very rare, isn't it?
Well, that's the only thing I would disagree.
It's rare under the 14th Amendment.
Oh, of course it's rare. This is a one-off situation. And, Your Honor, the only thing...
Well, it is one-off. I don't disagree with you. But it's not with respect to how we've defined self-executing.
We're not asking this court to redefine the concept of non-self-execution. We were careful in our brief not to rely on that phrase. And Griffin's
right,
case
you are because it's not.
That's right. And Griffin's
so
case...
now the question is a very different one in my mind. I understand what you're relying on, Griffin. Let's just be very clear.
Right.
Griffin was not a precedential Supreme Court decision.
That's correct.
All right? It was a circuit court decision by a justice who, when he becomes a justice, writes in the Davies case, he assumed that Jefferson Davis would be ineligible to hold any office, particularly the presidency, and treated, and this is his words, Section 3 as executing itself, needing no legislation on the part of Congress to give it effect. So you're relying on a non-presidential case by a justice who later takes back what he said.
But the key point with Griffin's case and why it's an important precedent, despite everything Your Honor said, it is not a precedent of this court. But Griffin's case provided the backdrop against which Congress legislated the Enforcement Act of 1870 when it first provided an enforcement mechanism for Section 3.
It did away with it later.
It did away with it later, but
that has nothing to say with respect to what Section 3 means. Can we get to the issue, which is, I think, one that I go back to that I started with, and very briefly, what sense does it say that states can't enforce Section 3 against their own officials? I mean, I think logically those are 2 separate issues in my mind. Can states enforce the insurrection clause against their own office holders, or can they enforce it against federal officials, or can they enforce it against the president? Those are all 3 different questions in my mind.
And the answer to all 3 of those questions turns on whether this court agrees with the holding of Griffin's case. If Griffin's case is the proper enunciation of the law, then a state cannot do any of the things Your Honor suggested unless Congress gives it authority to do so.
So a non-presidential decision that relies on policy doesn't look at the language, doesn't look at the history, doesn't analyze anything than the disruption that such a suit would bring, you want us to credit as presidential?
Because Congress relied on Griffin's case when it enacted the Enforcement Act of 1870 and established...
So, Mr. Mitchell, if I may interrupt, but just to clarify, I mean, this sounds like your reply brief, where it sounds like you're not making a constitutional argument, you're really making a statutory preemption argument. And is that what you're doing here? You're not saying that the Constitution gives you this rule. It's the kind of combination of Griffin's case plus the way Congress acted after Griffin's case that gives you the rule?
That's exactly right, Justice Kagan, because we have implementing legislation. Congress took up the invitation provided by Griffin's case and established writs of quo warranto in the 1870 Enforcement Act, later repealed them. The only enforcement legislation that's currently on the books is the Insurrection Criminal Statute, Section 2383. And when Congress made all of these decisions, the initial enactment of the Enforcement Act in 1870, the repeal of the quo warranto provisions in 1948, all of those were made with Griffin's case as the backdrop.
Please.
Well, the understanding was that these congressionally established remedies would be exclusive of state court remedies. So there's not an express statement of preemption in these statutes, but there didn't need to be because Griffin's case provided the backdrop.
And if I could just understand the argument a little bit better, suppose that we took all of that away. You know, suppose there were no Griffin's case and there were no subsequent congressional enactment. What do you then think the rule would be?
So just as a matter of first principles without Griffin's case, it's a much harder argument for us to make because normally, I mean, every other provision of the 14th Amendment has been treated as self-executing. What we would argue, and that's hypothetical that Your Honor has suggested, is that there are practical considerations unique to Section 3 that counsel in favor of a rule similar to what Chief Justice Chase spelled out in Griffin's case. And it goes to, I think, the policy concerns he talks about, where this was a case, Griffin's case involved a convicted criminal who was seeking a writ of habeas corpus on the ground that the judge who tried his case was an insurrectionist disqualified under Section 3. And Chief Justice Chase realizes that if he enforces Section 3 in this situation, it would nullify every official act taken not only by this particular judge, but by anyone who is an insurrectionist or arguably an insurrectionist under Section 3.
Well, why do you need those consequential concerns, though? I mean, it kind of seems to me that what Justice Kagan is getting at is why don't you have an argument that the Constitution of its own force, that Section 3 of its own force preempts the state's ability not necessarily, I think not, to enforce Section 3 against its own officers, but against federal officers, like in a Tarbell's case kind of way.
So there could also be an argument that's more limited. You're suggesting there may be a barrier under the Constitution to a state legislating an enforcement mechanism for Section 3 specific to federal officers. We could rely on precedents such as McClung that says that state courts lack the authority to issue mandamus relief against federal officials.
Well, why aren't you making those arguments?
Because that doesn't get us, that Griffin's case
only gets you out of state court, it doesn't get you out of federal court.
And also the holding of Griffin's case went well beyond that because Chief Justice Chase said in this opinion, which again provided the backdrop for the congressional enforcement legislation, that states had no role in enforcing Section 3 unless Congress was to give them that authority through a statute that they passed pursuant to their
But your arguments...
No, please, go ahead.
I was just going to add one last thing. I think your argument's a little broader than that because I think if we accept your position that disqualifying someone from the ballot is adding a qualification. Really, your position is that Congress can't enact a statute that would allow Colorado to do what it's done either, because then Congress would be adding a qualification, which it can't do either.
No, I don't agree with that, Justice Barrett. Congress is not bound by the holding of term limits. Term limits only prohibits the states from adding additional qualifications or altering the Constitution's qualifications for federal office. It does not purport to restrain Congress. So if Congress were to enact implementing legislation that authorized the states to exclude insurrectionists from the ballot, we believe that would be valid enforcement legislation under Section 3, with an important caveat. There has to be congruence and proportionality under this court's precedent. So
why would that be permissible? Because Section 3 refers to the holding of office, not running for office. And so if a state or Congress were to go further and say that you can't run for the office, you can't compete in a primary, wouldn't that be adding an additional qualification for serving for president? You must have been free from this disqualification at an earlier point in time than Section 3 specifies.
I think the answer to your question, Justice Alito, depends on how you interpret the word enforce in Section 5. And some members of this court, such as Justice Scalia, thought that enforce means you can do nothing more than enact legislation that mirrors the 14th Amendment's self-executing requirements, and you can't go an inch beyond that. That's not the current jurisprudence of this court.
No, well, all right, you have to decide whether it's congruent and proportional, and we would get into the question of whether that would be congruent and proportional. Well, let me shift gear a little bit. I take you to argue, and I think this is right, that the term self-executing is a misnomer as applied here.
Yes,
very often, when we use the term, what we're referring to is the proposition that a particular provision of the Constitution or a statute in and of itself creates a private right of action. That's not what the issue is here.
No, that's not the issue here, and sometimes the phrase self-executing is used that way. The only thing I would add is sometimes it's used in a different sense. With self-executing treaties or non-self-executing treaties, the issue is whether that treaty has any force as domestic law whatsoever.
Right. But I don't see what is gained by using this term, which is used in different contexts, rather than directly addressing what's involved here, which is the question of who can enforce Section 3 with respect to a presidential candidate. The consequences of what the Colorado Supreme Court did, some people claim, would be quite severe. Would it not permit, would it not lead to the possibility that other states would say, using their choice of law rules and their rules on collateral estoppel, that there's non-mutual collateral estoppel against former President Trump. And so the decision of the Colorado Supreme Court could effectively decide this question for many other states, perhaps all other states. Could it not lead to that consequence?
I don't think so, because Colorado law does not recognize non-mutual collateral estoppel, and I believe the preclusive effect of the decision would be determined by Colorado law rather than the law of another state. But I think your question, Justice Alito, gives rise to an even greater concern, because if this decision does not have preclusive effect in other lawsuits, it opens the possibility that a different factual record could be developed in some of the litigation that occurs in other states, and different factual findings could be entered by state trial court judges. They might conclude that, as a matter of fact, that President Trump did not have any intent to engage in incitement, or make some other finding that differs from what this trial court judge found.
Yeah, exactly. So in this decision, the trial court in Colorado thought that it was proper to admit the January 6th report, and it also admitted the testimony of an expert who testified about the meaning of certain words and phrases to people who communicate with and among extremists, right? Another state court could reach an opposite conclusion on both of those questions.
Certainly. Other states could conclude that the January 6th report is inadmissible hearsay. They might also conclude that statements within the January 6th report were hearsay, even if the report itself is not. And they could certainly reach a different conclusion with respect to the expert testimony of Professor Simi. Perhaps in another state, we would have time to produce our own sociology expert who would contradict Professor Simi.
Should these considerations be dismissed as simply consequentialist arguments, or do they support a structural argument that supports the position that you're taking here?
I think they all mutually reinforce each other. We have an argument, we believe, that is sufficient to dispose of this case just based on the meaning of officer of the United States, as well as the argument we're making based on term limits. But all of the consequentialist considerations that Your Honor has suggested are additional reasons to reverse the Colorado Supreme Court, although we don't think it's necessary to get into consequences because the law is clearly on our side.
You keep saying term limits. There are other presidential qualifications in the Constitution: age,
yes,
citizenship. There's a separate amendment, the 22nd Amendment, that doesn't permit anyone to run for a second term. We have a history of states disqualifying, not all, but some, of disqualifying candidates who won't be of age if elected. We have a history of at least one state disqualifying someone who wasn't a U.S. citizen.
Right.
Are your arguments limited to Section 3?
Not quite. The question, Justice Sotomayor, is whether the state is violating term limits by adding to or altering the extant qualifications for the presidency in the Constitution. Now,
so you want us to say, I'm wondering why the term limits qualification is important to you.
Because
are you setting up so that if some president runs for a third term, that a state can't disqualify him from the ballot?
Of course a state can disqualify him from the ballot, because that is a qualification that is categorical. It's not defeasible by Congress. So a state is enforcing the Constitution when it says you can't appear on our ballot if you've already served 2 terms as president. The same
if they're underage when elected, and the same if they're not a U.S. citizen.
The same if they're not, the same if they're not a U.S. citizen, for sure. The age is a little more nuanced, because you can imagine a scenario where the person is 34 years old at the time of the election, but he turns 35 before inauguration.
Well, then that would come up. That would probably come up to us at some point. The state would make a decision and say he's ineligible, and we would have to decide that question then. But my point is, so what? Adding qualifications to what term limit is your argument based on?
You're changing.
I'm just confused.
Okay. With respect to maybe I'll start with the age example. If a state like Colorado says you can't appear on our presidential ballot unless you are 35 years old on the day of the election, that would be a violation of term limits, because there could be a 34-year-old on the day of the election who turns 35 before Inauguration Day. What Colorado has done here, what their Supreme Court has done, is similar, because under Section 3, President Trump needs to qualify during the time that he would hold office, And the Colorado Supreme Court is saying to President Trump, you have to show that you would qualify under Section 3 now, at the time of the election, or at the time that we, the state Supreme Court.
Now, I just a point of clarification so we're all on the same page. When you say term limits, you mean our decision in the term limits case.
Yes, I'm sorry.
The constitutional provision governing term limits.
Yes, U.S. term limits against Thornton. Maybe I should call it Thornton instead of term limits. I'm sorry.
Does it have something to do with the fact that the particular circumstance that you're talking about can change? Is that what you mean? I'm trying to understand the distinction between the provision in the Constitution that relates to disqualification on the basis of insurrection behavior and these other provisions that Justice Sotomayor points out. They all seem to me to be extant constitutional requirements. So, but you're drawing a distinction.
Right, I'm drawing a distinction because some of them are categorical.
What do you mean by categorical? Whether or not you are an insurrectionist is or is not categorical?
It is not categorical because Congress can lift the disability by a 2/3 vote. And
but why does that change the initial determination of whether or not you fall into the category? I don't understand the fact that you can be excused from having been in the category. Why does that not make it a categorical determination?
Because we don't know whether President Trump will be excused before he's sworn in, if he wins the election, on January 20th, 2025. And a court that is saying that President Trump has to show now, today, that he would qualify under Section 3 is accelerating the deadline that the Constitution provides for him to obtain a waiver from Congress.
But that's by virtue of the hold, right? Hold office. This is
correct. Section 3 bans him only from holding office.
All right, can I ask you, now that I have the floor,
yes.
Can I ask you to address your first argument, which is the officer point? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, why don't we?
Could we? Is that okay if we do this and then we go to that?
Sure.
You know,
Go ahead.
Will there be an opportunity to do officer stuff, or should we?
Absolutely.
I just want to understand. So on this theory, what is the sum total of ways that that Section 3 can be enforced? That somebody out there can say, yes, there's been a former president who engaged or led or participated in an insurrection, and so should be disqualified from office, putting aside the officer argument.
Right.
What is the sum total of ways that enforcement can happen?
So the answer to that question is going to depend on what Your Honor thinks of Griffin's case. So if this court were to affirm the rationale of Griffin's case, then the only way Section 3 could be enforced is through congressional legislation that creates a remedy. So Congress could reinstate the quo warranto provisions that they initially had in the 1870s.
Is that your position?
Yes, because we believe Griffin's case is correctly decided and should be followed.
And how does that fit with a lot of the answers to the questions that we've been given? You said, well, Congress has to have the ability by a 2/3 vote to lift the disqualification.
Right.
But so too, I would think that provision would be in some tension with what you just said. Because if Congress has the ability to lift the vote by a 2/3 majority, then surely it can't be right that one house of Congress can do the exact same thing by a simple majority.
Yeah, there certainly is some tension, Justice Kagan, and some commentators have pointed this out. Professor Bode and Professor Paulson criticized Griffin's
Then
case
I must
very
be
sharply.
right.
Well, we don't think this problem is fatal, because to us, the 2/3 provision that allows Congress to lift a disability is something akin to a pardon power, where Congress, through enforcement legislation, creates a mechanism by which the insurrectionist issue is to be determined by some entity. It could be the legislature. In the case of an elected member of Congress, each house has the ability to judge the qualifications of their members. Or if it's outside the situation of Congress, it would be whatever Congress enacts. So when it was the writs of quo warranto, each federal prosecutor had the authority to bring a quo warranto writ against an incumbent official and seek his ouster from office under Section 3, but it was still subject to that amnesty provision in Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. So we do acknowledge the tension, but we don't think that's an insurmountable obstacle.
I don't even see why there's a tension. If you analogize the lifting by Congress of the disqualification by a 2/3 vote to a pardon, then surely one would not argue that the fact that the president or governor can pardon someone from a criminal conviction or a criminal offense means that the person couldn't be prosecuted in the first place for the criminal offense.
That's right.
Right?
Yes.
So I don't see what the tension is. They're two separate things. Did the person engage in this activity, which is prohibited? And second, even if the person did engage in the activity, are there reasons why the disqualification or should be lifted or the pardon should be granted?
That's right. I mean, if the court accepts the holding of Griffin's case, that's exactly the regime that we would have.
Yeah, I don't see there's tension, but also there's a limit on what one can infer from the mere fact that Congress can lift the disqualification. You can't infer from that it is impermissible to have a prior determination that the person did engage in the insurrection. You can't make that inference. It's not
Well,
logical.
but I think what's intention is that you would have the exact same actor and say, look, that actor can lift the disqualification by a 2/3 vote. But you're saying only that actor can put the disqualification into effect in the first place, and it can do that by far less than 2/3. It can do that just by a simple majority of one house.
Or it could do that by doing nothing at all, if the holding of Griffin's case is correct, because just congressional inaction would effectively act as
the only thing it takes to have no action is half plus one saying we don't feel like it.
But that's why we tried to characterize our Griffin's case argument the way we did, where we rely on preemption doctrines as well. So we
don't you think Griffin's case is also relevant to trying to figure out what the original public meaning of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment is? It's by the Chief Justice of the United States a year after the 14th Amendment. That seems to me highly probative of what the meaning or understanding of that language, otherwise elusive language, is.
I do think it's probative, Justice Kavanaugh. We didn't rely too heavily on the point that you're making, partly because we have this other opinion from Justice Chase in the Jefferson Davis case. So that argument could potentially boomerang on us, which is why we didn't push it very hard in our briefing. But I think Your Honor is right. This is...
why don't you finish your sentence?
It is relevant and probative for sure, but I think there is other evidence too that might perhaps undercut the usefulness of trying to characterize Griffin's case as completely emblematic of the original understanding.
Now, why don't we move on to the officer point?
Certainly.
And Justice Jackson, I think you...
Yeah, so I had a question about it because you're making a textualist argument. And as I look at Section 3, I see two parts of the first sentence of Section 3. The first is a list of offices that a disqualified person is barred from holding. And the second are specific circumstances that give rise to disqualification. So first, am I right about seeing that there are two different things happening in the first sentence of section? Okay.
For sure.
So are you arguing both in this case or just one? Are you arguing both that the office of the presidency should not be considered one of the barred offices and that a person who previously took the presidential oath is not subject to disqualification?
We are arguing both, Your Honor.
I don't see that in your brief. I see a lot of focus on the second, but not on the first.
There is definitely more focus on the second, and we acknowledge that we have a somewhat heavier lift on the first point.
Why? It seems to me that you have a list and president is not on it.
That's certainly an argument in our favor, but they're also, with respect to officer of the United States, that's used repeatedly in the Constitution, in the Commissions Clause, in the Appointments Clause, and also in the Impeachment Clause. And every time it appears, it's used in a way that clearly excludes.
No, I understand, but that's the second argument. So the first argument is we have a list of offices that a person is barred from holding, right?
Yes.
Under your theory or under the language of, and we see it begins with senator, representative, elector of the president and vice president, and all other civil or military officers.
Offices under the United States.
Offices under the United States. But the word president or vice president does not appear specifically in that list. So I guess I'm trying to understand, are you giving up that argument, and if so, why?
No, we're not giving it up at all. You're right, the president and the vice president are not specifically listed. But the Anderson litigants claim that they are encompassed within the meaning of the phrase office under the United States.
And do you agree that the framers would have put such a high and significant and important office, sort of smuggled it in through that catch-all phrase?
We don't agree at all. That's why we're still making the argument that the presidency is excluded from the covered offices that are listed at the beginning of Section 3.
I'm sorry. Your brief says you didn't take a position on that point.
I'm sorry.
And your brief said, I don't have the site, I apologize. You don't affirmatively argue that point, I think is what your brief said.
In the blue brief?
Yes.
Well, we certainly argued it in the reply brief, and I'll have to look at how we phrased it. But we did point out in our opening brief that there are potential issues if this court were to rule on office under, because that phrase appears in other parts of the Constitution, including the Emoluments Clause, the Impeachment Disqualification Clause.
Would we necessarily have to say, I mean, I thought the point was that Section 3 was unique, that there was something happening with Section 3 that could explain why certain offices were left off or whatnot.
Perhaps, but there are also implications from other parts of the Constitution which really help us on the officer of the United States argument, and that's second part of Section 3, but somewhat cut against us when it comes to office under the United States. And the Anderson litigants point this out in footnote 9 in the red brief, where they say if this court were to say the presidency is an excluded office under the United States, that could imply, for example, the president is not covered by the emoluments.
Mr. Mitchell,
yes.
Stepping back on this, a lot hinges on the difference between, in your argument, between the term office and officer.
Yes.
And I guess I'm wondering, what theory do you have from an original understanding or a textualist perspective why those two terms so closely related would carry such different weight?
Because it's clear from the constitutional text that there are officers that do not hold offices under the United States. For example, the Speaker of the House and the President pro tempore, they're described as officers in Article 1 who are chosen by the legislature. They also have to be officers if they're able to be covered by the Presidential Succession Act, because under the Constitution, only officers can serve when there's a vacancy in both the presidency and the vice presidency. So they're officers, but they're not offices under the United States because of the Incompatibility Clause, which says that if you're a member of Congress, you cannot simultaneously hold an office under the United States. So that provision of the Constitution clearly demonstrates that members of Congress can't hold offices.
I appreciate that response. Is there anything in the original drafting, history, discussion that you think illuminates why that distinction would carry such profound weight?
Not of which we're aware. So these are textual inferences that we're drawing from constitutional structure, intratextualist analysis. But we aren't relying necessarily on the thought processes of the people who drafted these provisions, because they're unknowable, but even if they were knowable, we're not sure they would be relevant in any event, because this language, especially in Section 3, was enacted as a compromise. There were certainly radical Republicans who wanted to go much further. If you look at some of the earlier drafts that were proposed, some people wanted to ban all insurrectionists from holding office, regardless of whether they previously swore an oath. Some people wanted to go further and ban them even from voting.
Thank you, Counsel. I just have one very technical question. The statute in 1870, if it were still in effect, would require you to modify your arguments slightly. It was repealed, as you say, in 1948. I tried to find it, but I couldn't. Do you know why it was repealed?
No, we don't know why. It looks like it was done as part of a reorganization of the U.S. Code. So it doesn't appear there was any policy motivation behind that decision. I think a lot of things got repealed during this 1948 decisions that were made.
Okay. Justice Thomas, anything further? Justice Alito?
Is there any history of states using Section 3 as a way to bar federal office holders?
Not that I'm aware of, Justice Alito, because of Griffin's case. I mean, Griffin's case has been the law. I shouldn't say that it's been the law, because it was just a circuit court decision, but that has been the settled understanding of Section 3 since 1870 when it was decided.
Thank you.
Justice Sotomayor?
I just want to pin down your principal argument on Section 3. You argue that even though the president may or may not qualify, presidency may or may not qualify as an office under the United States, your principal argument is that the president is not an officer of the United States, correct?
Yeah, I would say it a little more forcefully than what Your Honor just described. We believe the presidency is excluded from office under the United States, but the argument we have that he's excluded the president as an officer of the United States is the stronger of the two textually and has fewer implications for other constitutions.
Bit of a gerrymandered rule, isn't it, designed to benefit only your client?
I certainly wouldn't call it gerrymander. That implies nefarious intent.
Well, you didn't make it up. I know some scholars have been discussing it, but just so we're clear, under that reading, only the petitioner is disqualified, because virtually every other president except Washington has taken an oath to support the Constitution, correct?
That's right. Every president, to our knowledge, every other president. John Adams might also be excluded because he took the oath as a vice president, which is not an officer. But yes, President Biden would certainly be covered. He took the oath as a member of Congress, and that's true of every previous president.
Would that be true if we were to hold more narrowly in a reversal that it's not Section 3 that's at issue, but Thornton and others as to whether Section 3 can be enforced by states against the president?
That would extend to every presidential candidate, not
exactly,
just our
not just
client.
to
That's
yours.
correct. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Justice Kagan?
And if I could just understand, I mean, given that you say you don't have a lot of evidence that the founding or the generation that we're looking at is really thinking about office versus officer of the United States, I mean, it would suggest that we should ask, is that a rule a sensible one? You know, if they had thought about it, what reason would they have given for that rule? And it does seem as though there's no particular reason, and you can think of lots of reasons for the contrary, to say that the only people who have engaged in insurrection who are not disqualified from office are presidents who have not held high office before. Why would that rule exist?
I don't think there is a good rationale given that this was compromise legislation. And sometimes this happens with statutory compromises and even constitutional compromises. There's an agreed upon set of words that can pass both houses of Congress. But different legislators may have had goals and motivations. They didn't all get their way. In a compromise, everyone goes away miserable. But this was the text that was settled upon. And it does seem odd that President Trump would fall through the cracks in a sense. But if officer of the United States means appointed officials, there's just no way he can be covered under Section 3. The court would have to reject our officer argument to get to that point.
And is there any better reason, if you go to the office argument that Justice Jackson was suggesting, is there any better reason for saying that an insurrectionist cannot hold the whole panoply of offices in the United States, but we're perfectly fine with that insurrectionist being president?
I think that's an even tougher argument for us to make as a policy matter, because one would think of all offices, the presidency would be the one you'd want to keep out the Confederate insurrectionists. That's the commander-in-chief of the Army. So, again, that's why we're leaning more on the officer of argument than the office under. We're not conceding office under, but we definitely have the stronger textual case and structural case on officer of the United States.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Justice Gorsuch?
Respond to some of the specific textual arguments on the officer of with respect to the appointments clause, the impeachment clause, and some of the others.
Yeah, so the way, I'll start with the commission's
The ball has been bouncing on that back and forth, and I wanted to see where you landed today.
There are three different textual inferences that could be drawn from each of those provisions Your Honor just mentioned. But the commission's clause, I think, is the strongest because it says the president shall, commission all the officers of the United States. Shall is mandatory. All is all-encompassing, and the president doesn't commission himself, and he can't commission himself. So that's one of the first problems. I think the Anderson litigants are trying to say, there's somehow an implied exception there because the president obviously can't commission himself, so we should construe that to mean all officers of the United States besides the president. But you also have members of Congress who are not commissioned by the president, and that's because they're not officers of the United States. So the only sensible distinction that we can see, given the language of the commission's clause, is that officers of the United States are appointed officials, and elected officials, such as members of Congress, and the president and the vice president are not. And the impeachment clause reinforces that. The president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office upon impeachment for and conviction of all high crimes and misdemeanors. The president and the vice president are listed separately from officers of the United States. And then, of course, the appointments clause, we know the president is not appointed pursuant to Article 2, neither is the vice president, neither are members of Congress, so they can't be officers either.
And how does Article 1, Section 6 fit into this discussion?
And this is about officers being in the line of succession?
Yes, exactly.
Right, so you have to be an officer to be in the line of succession. We have a federal statute that puts the Speaker and the President pro tempore in the line of succession. They are officers, but they're not officers of the United States because they're not subject to impeachment, they're not commissioned by the President, and they're not appointed pursuant to Article 2. So there is this gap between the term officer and the phrase officers of the United States, reinforcing the idea that officers of the United States is a term of art that doesn't refer just to federal office holders, which is what the Anderson litigants are claiming, but refers only to those who are appointed, not to those who are elected.
Thank you.
Justice Kavanaugh?
And just make sure I understand how you're using Griffin's case again. Section 3 refers to insurrection and raises questions about who decides what processes are to be used. That's ratified in 1868. The next year, Chief Justice Chase opines that states do not have the authority, that only Congress has the authority to enforce that. That could be evidence, as you say, of the original public meaning, at least some evidence. It's a precedent, although not binding. But your point then is it's reinforced because Congress itself relies on that precedent in the Enforcement Act of 1870 and forms the backdrop against which Congress does legislate. And then, as Justice Alito says, the historical practice for 155 years has been that that's the way it's gone. There haven't been state attempts to enforce disqualification under Section 3 against federal officers in the years since. So whether that's a Federalist 37 liquidation argument, it all reinforces what happened back in 1868, 1869, and 1870.
All right.
You want to add to that, alter that?
No, I think that's exactly right. And the last part you mentioned, Your Honor, is crucial to our argument, that Congress relied on Griffin's case. It provided the backdrop against which they legislated, which is why we should read these extant enforcement mechanisms, and right now the only one left is the federal insurrection statute, 2383, as exclusive of state court remedies. It's a form of implied preemption, almost see clamor's implicit preemption of other remedies, because Congress made these decisions in explicit reliance on Griffin's case.
And if we agree with you on Griffin's case and what you've elaborated on there, that's the end of the case, right?
It should be, yes, unless Congress decides to enact a statute, which we can't rely on.
A new statute in addition to 2383. And just to be clear, under 2383, you agree that someone could be prosecuted for insurrection by federal prosecutors, and if convicted, could be or shall be disqualified then from office.
Yes, but the only caveat that I would add is that our client is arguing that he has presidential immunity, so we would not concede that he can be prosecuted for what he did on January 6th under 2383.
Understood. Asking a question about the theory of 2383. Thank you.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
So Griffin's case was a collateral proceeding, so it's habeas relief.
Yes.
Could Griffin have, so even if Section 3 is not a basis for collateral relief in habeas, which was new at the time, could Griffin have raised at his trial or in direct appeal the argument that Judge Sheffy, you can't legitimately sit or constitutionally sit on my case because you're an insurrectionist and you're disqualified? Could he have won then?
No.
Why?
Not if Griffin's case is correct. So a court would have to reject the rationale of Griffin's case to accept what Your Honor is suggesting.
Well, why? Like I said, Griffin's case, I think there's some language that might be a little bit broad, but at bottom, Griffin's case is about a collateral habeas proceeding. And Griffin had brought his case after the fact. He needed a cause of action. Why wouldn't it work in a trial for him to challenge Sheffy's constitutional ability to adjudicate his case?
What Griffin's case holds is that only Congress can provide the means of enforcing Section 3. And under Your Honor's hypothetical, Congress has not enacted any such statute that would give Mr. Griffin the right to raise those types of arguments at his trial. So he would have to await legislation from Congress.
Okay, let's assume that I disagree with you about the officer argument. So Section 3 covers President Trump. Let's say that Congress enacts a quo warranto provision that would allow a state, or I guess it doesn't really matter for this purpose, even a federal prosecutor, to bring such an action against him, to remove him from office in the quo warranto way. Wouldn't that be in some tension with impeachment? He would be extracted from office outside of the process of impeachment. Couldn't then President Trump simply say, well, the only way to get me out of office is the impeachment process and not this quo warranto action?
So I don't know how that would play out, because the quo warranto actions that were brought, that I'm aware of, under the 1870 Enforcement Act were brought against state officials. And Your Honor's impeachment hypothetical would apply not only to the president, but any federal officer of the United States.
I know.
So I don't know how that played out in the courts and whether anyone ever tried to argue that impeachment was the exclusive remedy for.
Well, I don't think anybody did argue it. I guess what I'm asking is, you said it's Congress's exclusive province.
Yes.
And you also said that it has to apply, after one is holding office, is elected. And I'm asking whether then the implication of your argument is that Congress could not enact such a provision that applied against federal office holders that were covered by Section 3 as opposed to state ones.
I believe they could. And the impeachment clause says that the president, the vice president, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office upon impeachment and conviction. But it doesn't say that's the only way you can remove them. I mean, Congress can defund a position, and effectively, it's not quite the same as formal removal. But the other relevant precedent is Stewart against Laird, when the Jeffersonians repealed the Midnight Judges Act and abolished all of these positions for federal judges. And some people thought that was unconstitutional because they thought the only way you could eliminate federal judges was through impeachment. But Chief Justice Marshall upheld that statute. So that, to me, is a relevant precedent showing that impeachment is not the only way to get rid of a federal official.
Okay, let me just ask one question, and this is just a point of clarification. Does President Trump have any kind of due process right here? I mean, I'm wondering, this kind of goes not to the cause of action point or the preemption point, but more to the question of what procedures he might have been entitled to. You don't make the argument that he was entitled to any, nor did I see the argument that he had any kind of constitutionally protected right to ballot access, so that he was, constitutionally entitled to an opportunity to be heard. Is that right? He had no due process right?
We made that argument below. We did not make that in our briefs to this court for several reasons. I mean, Your Honor's, I think, suggesting, and this is correct, that the proceedings below, to put it charitably, were highly irregular.
Well, I wasn't suggesting that. I was just asking.
The question seems to suggest that there might be due process issues, but we didn't develop that argument in this court for several reasons. Winning on due process doesn't really do as much for our client as the other arguments that we've made, because that would be a ruling specific to this particular proceeding in the state of Colorado and would leave the door open for Colorado to continue on remand to exclude him from the ballot.
Okay, thank you.
Justice Jackson?
Back to whether the presidency is one of the barred offices, I guess I'm a little surprised at your response to Justice Kagan, because I thought that the history of the 14th Amendment actually provides the reason for why the presidency may not be included. And by that I mean, I didn't see any evidence that the presidency was top of mind for the framers when they were drafting Section 3, because they were actually dealing with a different issue. The pressing concern, at least as I see the historical record, was actually what was going on at lower levels of the government. The possible infiltration and embedding of insurrectionists into the state government apparatus, and the real risk that former Confederates might return to power in the South via state-level elections, either in local offices or as representatives of the states in Congress. And that's a very different lens. If your concern is trying to make sure that these people don't come back through the state apparatus and control the government in that direction, seems to me very different than the worry that an insurrectionist will seize control of the entire national government through the presidency. And so I just am surprised that you would, given the text of the provision and the historical context that seems to demonstrate that their concern or their focus was not about the presidency, I just don't understand why you're giving that argument up.
There is some evidence to suggest that, Justice.
Is there any evidence to suggest that the presidency was what they were focused on?
There is some evidence of that. There were people saying we don't want Jefferson Davis to be elected president, and there was also one of the drafts of Section 3 specifically mentioned the presidency and the vice presidency.
But it wasn't the final.
It wasn't the final.
So
it wasn't. Yes,
right.
I'm sorry. It wasn't the final enactment, but it does show that there was some concern by some people about Confederate insurrectionists ascending to the presidency. And we didn't want to make a law office history type argument where we just look at the historical evidence and pick the evidence that we like and interpret it tendentiously, because the other side can get back with us and throw this countervailing evidence back in our face. So we wanted to focus more on the text of the Constitution, because this was ultimately a compromise provision that was enacted in Section 3.
All right, let me ask you another question about the states, because you have forcefully made an argument about the states not being able to enforce Section 3. So if we agree with you on that, what happens next? I mean, I thought you also wanted us to end the litigation. So is there a possibility that this case continues in federal court if that's our conclusion?
No, I don't see how it could unless Congress were to enact a statute in response to this court's decision.
So your point is that we would have to say congressional enacting legislation is necessary for either state or federal enforcement.
That's correct.
All right, final question. The Colorado Supreme Court concluded that the violent attempts of the petitioner's supporters in this case to halt the count on January 6th qualified as an insurrection as defined by Section 3. And I read your opening brief to accept that those events counted as an insurrection, but then your reply seemed to suggest that they were not. So what is your position as to that?
We never accepted or conceded in our opening brief that this was an insurrection. What we said in our opening brief was President Trump did not engage in any act that can plausibly be characterized as insurrection.
All right, so why would this not be an what is your argument that it's not? Your reply brief says that it wasn't because I think you say it did not involve an organized attempt to overthrow the government. So
that's one of many reasons, but for an insurrection, there needs to be an organized, concerted effort to overthrow the government of the United States through violence. And this
so
riot
the point
that
is that a chaotic effort to overthrow the government is not an insurrection?
No, we didn't concede that it's an effort to overthrow the government either, Justice Jackson, right? None of these criteria were met. This was a riot. It was not an insurrection. The events were shameful, criminal, violent, all of those things, but it did not qualify as insurrection as that term is used in Section 3.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
Mr. Murray?
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court, we are here because for the first time since the War of 1812, our nation's capital came under violent assault. For the first time in history, the attack was incited by a sitting president of the United States to disrupt the peaceful transfer of presidential power. By engaging in insurrection against the Constitution, President Trump disqualified himself from public office. As we heard earlier, President Trump's main argument is that this court should create a special exemption to Section 3 that would apply to him and to him alone. He says Section 3 disqualifies all oath-breaking insurrectionists except a former president who never before held other state or federal office. There is no possible rationale for such an exemption, and the court should reject the claim that the framers made an extraordinary mistake. Section 3 uses deliberately broad language to cover all positions of federal power requiring an oath to the Constitution. My friend relies on a claimed difference between an office under and an officer of the United States, but this case does not come down to mere prepositions. The two phrases are two sides of the same coin, referring to any federal office or to anyone who holds one. President Trump's other arguments for reversal ignore the constitutional role of the states in running presidential elections. Under Article 2 and the 10th Amendment, states have the power to ensure that their citizens' electoral votes are not wasted on a candidate who is constitutionally barred from holding office. States are allowed to safeguard their ballots by excluding those who are underage, foreign-born, running for a third presidential term, or, as here, those who have engaged in insurrection against the Constitution in violation of their oath. I welcome the court's questions.
Do you have contemporaneous examples, and by contemporaneous I mean shortly after the adoption of the 14th Amendment, where the states disqualified national candidates, not its own candidates, but national candidates?
The only example I can think of, Justice Thomas, is the example of Congressman Christie, who was elected in Georgia in, I believe, 1868, and the governor of Georgia refused or declined to certify the results of that election because Mr. Christie was disqualified. But I think it's not surprising that there are few examples because we didn't have ballots in the same way back then. Candidates were either write-in or they were party ballots, so the states didn't run the ballots in the same way, and there wouldn't have been a process for determining before an election whether a candidate was qualified, unlike the processes that we have now that states have created under their Article 1 and Article 2 powers to run elections.
But it would seem that particularly after Reconstruction, and after the Compromise of 1877 and during the period of Redeemers, that you would have that kind of conflict. There were a plethora of Confederates still around. There were any number of people who would continue to either run for state offices or national offices. So it seemed that would suggest that there would at least be a few examples of national candidates being disqualified, if your reading is correct.
Well, there were certainly national candidates who were disqualified by Congress refusing to seat them.
I understand that, but that's not this case. Did states disqualify them? That's what we're talking about here. I understand Congress would not seat them.
Other than the example I gave, no. But again, Your Honor, that's not surprising because there wouldn't have been, states certainly wouldn't have the authority to remove a sitting
So what's the purpose
officer.
what was the purpose of Section 3? The states were sending people. The concern was that the former Confederate states would continue being bad actors. And the effort was to prevent them from doing this. And you're saying that, well, this also authorized states to disqualify candidates. So what I'm asking you for, if you are right, what are the examples?
Well, Your Honor, the examples are states excluded many candidates for state office, individuals holding state offices. We have a number of published cases of states considering that.
I understand that. I understand the states controlling state elections and state positions. What we are talking about here are national candidates. I understand. You look at Foner or Foote, Shelby Foote, or McPherson, they all talk about, of course, the conflict after the Civil War. And there were people who felt very strongly about retaliating against the South, the radical Republicans. But they did not think about authorizing the South to disqualify national candidates. And that's the argument you're making. And what I would like to know is do you have any examples of this?
Many of those historians have filed briefs in our support in this case, making the point that the idea of the 14th Amendment was that both states and the federal government would ensure rights, and that if states failed to do so, the federal government certainly would also step in. But I think the reason why there aren't examples of states doing this is an idiosyncratic one of the fact that elections worked differently back then. States have a background power under Article 2 and the 10th Amendment to run presidential elections. They didn't use that power to police ballot access until about the 1890s. And by the 1890s, everyone had received amnesty and these issues had become moot. So I don't think the history tells us.
Sort of look at Justice Thomas's question sort of from the 30,000-foot level. I mean, the whole point of the 14th Amendment was to restrict state power, right? States shall not abridge privileges of immunity. They won't deprive people of property without due process. They won't deny equal protection. And on the other hand, it augmented federal power under Section 5. Congress has the power to enforce it. So wouldn't that be the last place that you'd look for authorization for the states, including Confederate states, to enforce, implicitly authorized, to enforce the presidential election process? That seems to be a position that is at war with the whole thrust of the 14th Amendment and very ahistorical.
No, Your Honor. First, we would locate the state's authority to run presidential elections not in the 14th Amendment, but in Article 2. And that power is nearly plenary to determine.
Yeah, but you're relying on, you have no reliance on Section 3, is that what you're saying?
No, Your Honor. Certainly we have reliance on Section 3 insofar as Article 2 gives states this broad power to determine how their electors are selected, and that broad power implies the narrower power to enforce federal constitutional qualifications.
Well, but the narrower power you're looking for is the power of disqualification, right? That is a very specific power in the 14th Amendment, and you're saying that was implicitly extended to the states under a clause that doesn't address that at all.
We would say that nothing in the 14th Amendment takes away from the states their broad and nearly plenary power to determine the manner of selecting their electors in the manner that they see fit. As this court said in Chiafalo, that power is nearly plenary unless something in the Constitution tells states they can't do it. And the structure of the 14th Amendment certainly was intended to expand federal power and certainly to restrict state power in some ways. But states are bound to enforce and apply, for example, Section 1 of the 14th Amendment. And so it's hard to see why states wouldn't be similarly bound or at least authorized.
That's not greater includes the lesser argument. The states have the power, the legislature has the power to choose electors, granted. But just because there's one authorized means in the Constitution to a particular end does not mean that there's any means to that end. And so I think you're taking that electors argument and bringing it into Section 3, where, as the Chief Justice says, there's just no, and Justice Thomas, there's no historical evidence to support the theory of Section 3, nor the overall, to explain the overall structure of the 14th Amendment.
We certainly have a long history in this country of states using their power to determine the manner of selecting presidential electors to enforce other qualifications in the Constitution. I don't take it there's a great debate about whether or not states are allowed to exclude underage or foreign-born candidates, or if President Bush or Obama wanted to run for a third term, that they could be excluded under that broad Article 2 power. I don't see why Section 3 should be treated any differently. Section 3 speaks in the same...
Well, when you look at Section 3, the term insurrection jumps out. And the questions are, what does that mean? How do you define it? Who decides? Who decides whether someone engaged in it? What processes, as Justice Barrett alluded to, what processes are appropriate for figuring out whether someone did engage in that? And that's all of what Chief Justice Chase focused on a year after the 14th Amendment to say, these are difficult questions, and you look right at Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, as the Chief Justice said, and that tells you Congress has the primary role here. I think what's different is the processes, the definition, who decides questions really jump out at you when you look at Section 3. Your response to that?
Well, certainly, Justice Kavanaugh, there has to be some process for determining those questions. And then the question becomes, does anything in the 14th Amendment say that only Congress can create that process? And Section 5 very clearly is not an exclusive provision. It says Congress shall have power.
But maybe put most boldly, I think that the question that you have to confront is why a single state should decide who gets to be president of the United States. In other words, this question of whether a former president is disqualified for insurrection to be president again is, just say it. It sounds awfully national to me. So whatever means there are to enforce it would suggest that they have to be federal, national means. Why does, if you weren't from Colorado and you were from Wisconsin or you were from Michigan, and it really, what the Michigan Secretary of State did is going to make the difference between, whether candidate A is elected or candidate B is elected. I mean, that seems quite extraordinary, doesn't it?
No, Your Honor, because ultimately it's this court that's going to decide that question of federal constitutional eligibility and settle the issue for the nation. And certainly it's not unusual that questions of national importance come up.
Well, I suppose this court would be saying something along the lines of that a state has the power to do it. But I guess I was asking you to go a little bit further and saying, why should that be the right rule? Why should a single state have the ability to make this determination, not only for their own citizens, but for the rest of the nation?
Because Article 2 gives them the power to appoint their own electors as they see fit. But if they're going to use a federal constitutional qualification as a ballot access determinant, then it's creating a federal constitutional question that then this court decides, and other courts, other states, if this court affirms the decision below, determining that President Trump is ineligible to be president, other states would still have to determine what effect that would have on their own state's law and state procedure.
Well, I mean, if we affirmed and we said he was ineligible to be president, yes, maybe some states would say, well, you know, we're going to keep him on the ballot anyway. But I mean, really, it's going to have, as Justice Kagan said, the effect of Colorado deciding. And it's true. I just want to push back a little bit on, well, it's a national thing because this court will decide it. You say that we have to review Colorado's factual record with clear error as the standard of review. So we would be stuck. The first mover state here, Colorado, we're stuck with that record. And, you know, I don't want to get into whether the record, I mean, maybe the record is great, but what if the record wasn't? I mean, what if it wasn't a fulsome record? What if, you know, the hearsay rules are, you know, one-offs? Or what if this is just made by the Secretary of State without much process at all? How do we review those factual findings? Why should clear error review apply? And doesn't that just kind of buckle back into this point that Justice Kagan was making, you know, that we made with Mr. Mitchell, too, that it just doesn't seem like a state call?
3 points, Your Honor. The first is that ordinarily, of course, this court reviews factual findings for clear error, but President Trump made the point in his reply brief that sometimes on constitutional questions that require a uniform resolution, this court can do something more like a Bose Corp-style independent review of the factual record. And we would have no objection to that, given that the record here, really the facts that are disputed here are incredibly narrow. The essence of our case is President Trump's own statements that he made in public view for all to see.
But then that's saying that in this context, which is very high stakes, if we review the facts essentially de novo, you want us all to just watch the video of the ellipse and then make a decision without any deference to or guidance from lower court fact-finding? That's unusual.
Well, ultimately, President Trump himself urges this court to decide the merits of his eligibility on the factual record here at page 2 of his brief. He's never at any point in this proceeding suggested there was something else that needed to be in the factual record, any other witnesses that he wanted to call to present his case. And again, the essence of our case is his own statements, and in particular, his own videotaped statements on the ellipse.
Mr. Murray, just to circle back to, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to, before we left it, I wanted to circle back to where Justice Kagan was. Do you agree that the state's powers here over its ballot for a federal officer election have to come from some constitutional authority?
Members of this court have disagreed about that.
I'm asking you.
The majority of this court has said that those powers come from Article 2, but we think that the result is the same whether the court locates it in Article 2 or in a reserved power under the 10th Amendment.
But you accept that this court has held. You're not contesting this or asking us to revisit that decision in Thornton or term limits or whatever you want to call it, that it has to come from some federal constitutional authority.
No, we are not, Your Honor.
Okay. And here we're not talking about the qualifications clause, right? Nobody's talking about whether he's 35 years old or natural born, whatever, right? Not an issue, okay. We're talking about something under the 14th Amendment and Section 3, so that's where you have to find your authority, right?
We find our authority in Article 2, in states' plenary power to run their election.
Federal election, but this is for a federal office. It has to come from the Constitution, and you're seeking to enforce Section 3.
We're suggesting that in their broad power to determine them, to select presidential electors in any manner they see fit, they can take account of Section 3 and apply Section 3.
Could they do it without Section 3? Could they disqualify somebody for, on whatever basis they wanted outside of the qualifications clause?
That would run into term limits,
I would think so, right? So it has to come back to Section 3. And if that's true, how does that work, given that Section 3 speaks about holding office, not who may run for office? It was a point Mr. Mitchell was making earlier, and I just wanted to give you a chance to respond to it, because it seems to me that you're asking to enforce in an election context a provision of the Constitution that speaks to holding office. So it's different than the qualifications clause, which is all about who can run and then serve, yeah.
I don't know that it is different. Okay. Other qualifications for office similarly talk about eligibility for the office. There's nothing unconstitutional about a 30-year-old trying to get on the ballot.
Except for this disability can be removed, right, under Section 3. That's what's different about it. So Thoughts on that?
Well, the fact that there's an extraordinary provision for removing the disability does not negate the fact that the disability exists today, and it's existed since January 6, 2021, when President Trump engaged in insurrection against the Constitution.
So were his actions after that date, before he left office, ultra vires? Is that where your theory leads?
Well, that would raise the separate question of whether one can collaterally attack the actions of a de facto officer. And that may be the one place in Griffin's case at the very end where we would agree, which is when Justice Chase said, I've talked to my Supreme Court colleagues and we unanimously agree that you can't collaterally attack all official actions of an officer who's in fact holding the position under Section.
But just circle back to where we started, right? That this is Section 3, your authority has to come from there, and it's about holding office, and it's a particular kind of disability that can be removed by Congress, and it's the only one like that, right? They can't remove age or citizenship. How should that inform our thoughts about a state's efforts to regulate the ballot for a federal office?
The colloquy that my friend had with Justice Alito earlier, I think, is illustrative here. The fact that Congress has an extraordinary removal power does not negate that the disability exists today and exists indefinitely into the future, much like the fact that the president can pardon somebody for a criminal conviction doesn't make that conviction somehow contingent. And I would note that if President Trump were appointed to an office today, if he were appointed as a state judge, he could not hold that office, which shows that the disability exists now. And the fact that Congress has a power to remove the disability doesn't negate the present qualification, nor does it implicitly bestow on President Trump a constitutional right to run for offices that he cannot hold in violation of state law and state procedure under Article 2.
In fact, there was a congressional action to permit Confederate officers or people who supported the Confederacy to hold office before the 14th Amendment, correct? So there must have been a thought that there was a pre-existing disqualification.
That's absolutely right. There were a flood of amnesty requests even before Section 3 went into effect because everybody understood at the time that those people would be disqualified the moment that Section 3 was enacted forever unless they received amnesty.
Counselor, what do you do with what would seem to me to be plain consequences of your position? If Colorado's position is upheld, surely there will be disqualification proceedings on the other side, and some of those will succeed. Some of them will have different standards of proof. Some of them will have different rules about evidence. Maybe the Senate report won't be accepted in others because it's hearsay. Maybe it's beyond a reasonable doubt, whatever. In very quick order, I would expect, although my predictions have never been correct, I would expect that a goodly number of states will say, whoever the Democratic candidate is, you're off the ballot, and others, for the Republican candidate, you're off the ballot, and it'll come down to just a handful of states that are going to decide the presidential election. That's a pretty daunting consequence.
Well, certainly, Your Honor, the fact that there are potential frivolous applications of a constitutional provision isn't a reason.
Well, no, hold on. I mean, you might think they're frivolous, but probably the people who are bringing them may not think they're frivolous. Insurrection is a broad term, and if there's some debate about it, I suppose that will go into the decision, and then eventually what we would be deciding whether there was an insurrection when one president did something as opposed to when somebody else did something else. And what do? Do we wait until near the time of counting the ballots and sort of go through which states are valid and which states aren't?
There's a reason Section 3 has been dormant for 150 years, and it's because we haven't seen anything like January 6th. Since Reconstruction. Insurrection against the Constitution is something extraordinary.
It seems to me you're avoiding the question, which is other states may have different views about what constitutes insurrection. And now you're saying, well, it's all right because somebody, presumably us, are going to decide, well, they said they thought that was an insurrection, but they were wrong. And maybe they thought it was right. And we'd have to develop rules for what constitutes an insurrection.
Yes, Your Honor, just like this court interprets other constitutional provisions, this court can make clear that an insurrection against the Constitution is something extraordinary. And in particular, it really requires a concerted group effort to resist through violence, not some ordinary application of state or federal law, but the functions mandated by the Constitution.
On your point that it's been dormant for 155 years, I think the other side would say the reason for that is Chief Justice Chase's opinion in 1869 in Griffin's case to start, which says that Congress has the authority here, not the states. That's followed up by the Enforcement Act of 1870, in which Congress acts upon that understanding, which is followed, and there's no history contrary in that period, as Justice Thomas pointed out. There's no history contrary in all the years leading up to this of states exercising such authority. I think the reason it's been dormant is because there's been a settled understanding that Chief Justice Chase, even if not right in every detail, was essentially right, and the branches of the government have acted under that settled understanding for 155 years, and Congress can change that. And Congress does have Section 2383, of course, the Insurrection Act criminal statute, but Congress could change it, but they have not in the 155 years in relevant respects for what you want here today, at least.
No, Justice Kavanaugh. The reason why it's been dormant is because by 1876, essentially all former Confederates had received amnesty, and we haven't seen anything like an insurrection since then. I'd like to address your point.
Well,
Can I go to that point?
After the...
Justice Alito?
I don't know how much we can infer from the fact that we haven't seen anything like this before, and therefore conclude that we're not going to see something in the future. From the time of the impeachment of President Johnson until the impeachment of President Clinton, more than 100 years later, there were no impeachments of presidents. And in fairly short order, over the last couple of decades, we've had 3. So I don't know how much you can infer from that.
Certainly, but if this court affirms, this court can write an opinion that emphasizes how extraordinary insurrection against the Constitution is and how rare that is, because it requires an assault not just on the application of law, but on constitutionally mandated functions themselves, like we saw on January 6th, a coordinated attempt to disrupt a function mandated by the 12th Amendment and essential to constitutional transfer.
Well, let me ask you a question about whether the power that you've described as plenary really is plenary. Suppose that the outcome of an election for president comes down to the vote of a single state, how the electors of the vote of a single state are going to vote. And suppose that candidate A gets a majority of the votes in that state, but the legislature really doesn't like candidate A, thinks candidate A is an insurrectionist, so the legislature then passes a law ordering its electors to vote for the other candidate. Do you think the state has that power?
I think there may be principles that come into play in terms of after the people have voted, that the state can't change the rules midstream. I'm not sure, because I'm not aware of this court addressing it. And certainly, as
let's change it so that it's not after the election. It's 3 days before the election, based on the fact that the polls in that state look bad. Can they do it?
I think they probably could under this court's decision in Chafalo, where this court emphasized that for much of American history, state legislatures picked their own electors and assigned their own electors themselves. But of course, that would be much more extraordinary than what we have here, which is simple application of normal state ballot access principles to say that we're only going to put on the ballot an individual who is qualified to assume the office.
Could I ask you again the question that Justice Gorsuch asked, to which you responded by citing the de facto officer doctrine? But suppose we look at that going forward rather than judging the validity of an act committed between the time when a president allegedly engages in an insurrection and the time when the president leaves office. During that interim period, would it be lawful for military commanders and other officers to disobey orders of the president in question?
I'm not sure that anything gives military officers the authority to adjudicate effectively the legality of the presidency.
Why not? Because you say he's disqualified from the moment it happens. Now, I understand the de facto officer doctrine might be used to prohibit people from seeking judicial remedies for decisions that take place after the date he was disqualified. But if he's in fact disqualified from that moment, why would anybody have to obey a direction from him?
Well, ultimately, there still has to be some kind of procedure in place to adjudicate the disqualification. Certainly, Congress could impeach a sitting president, but that's the only remedy I'm aware of that exists for removal or otherwise negating the authority of a sitting president.
Why? Well, on what theory? Because the Section 3 speaks about disqualification from holding office. You say he is disqualified from holding office from the moment it happens.
Correct, but nevertheless...
So it operates, you say that there's no legislation necessary. I thought that was the whole theory of your case. And no procedure necessary. It happens automatically.
Well, certainly you need a procedure in order to have any remedy to enforce the disqualification, which is different.
That's a whole separate question. That's the de facto doctrine. It doesn't work here. Okay, put that aside. He's disqualified from the moment. Self-executing, done. And I would think that a person who would receive a direction from that person, the president, former president in your view, would be free to act as he or she wishes without regard to that individual.
I don't think so, because I think, again, the de facto officer doctrine would nevertheless come into play to say this is...
No, de facto, that doesn't work, Mr. Murray, because de facto officer is to ratify the conduct that's done afterwards and insulate it from judicial review. Put that aside. I'm not going to say it again. Put it aside, okay? I think Justice Alito's asking a very different question, a more pointed one, and more difficult one for you, I understand, but I think it deserves an answer. On your theory, would anything compel a lower official to obey an order from, in your view, the former president?
I'm imagining a situation where, for example, a former president was, a president was elected and they were 25 and they were ineligible to hold office, but nevertheless they were put into that office.
No, we're talking about Section 3. Please don't change the hypothetical, okay? Please don't change the hypothetical. I know I like doing it too, but please don't do it, okay?
Well, the point I'm trying to make is
he's disqualified from the moment he committed an insurrection, whoever it is, whichever party, that happens. Boom. It happened. What would compel, and I'm not going to say it again, so just try and answer the question. If you don't have an answer, fair enough, we'll move on. What would compel a lower official to obey an order from that individual?
Because ultimately we have statutes and rules requiring chains of command. The person is in the office, and even if they don't have the authority to hold the office, the only way to get someone out of the office of the presidency is impeachment. And so I think if you interpreted Section 3 in light of other provisions in the Constitution like impeachment, while they hold office, impeachment's the only way to validate that they don't have the ability to hold that office and should be removed.
Mr. Murray, can I just ask you about something Justice Kagan brought up earlier, which is the concern about uniformity and the lack thereof if states are permitted to enforce Section 3 in presidential elections. And I guess I didn't really understand your argument or your response to her about that.
Well, certainly, if Congress is concerned about uniformity, they can provide for legislation and they can preempt state legislation.
Yes, but you say that's not necessary.
But it's not necessary. In the absence of federal enforcement legislation, these questions come up to this court in the same way that other federal questions come up to this court, which is that a state adjudicates them. If the state hasn't provided sufficient process to comport with due process, a notice, and opportunity to be heard, one can make those challenges. But assuming, as here, we have a full evidentiary record, an opportunity to present evidence.
No, I understand that we could resolve it so that we have a uniform ultimate ruling on it. I guess my question is why the framers would have designed a system that could result in interim disuniformity in this way, where we have elections pending and different states suddenly saying you are eligible, you're not, on the basis of this kind of thing.
Well, what they were concerned most about was ensuring that insurrectionists and rebels don't hold office. And so once one understands the sort of imperative that they had to ensure that oathbreakers wouldn't take office, it would be a little bit odd to say that states can't enforce it, that only the federal government can enforce it, and that Congress can essentially rip the heart out of Section 3 by a simple majority just by failing to pass enforcement legislation. Federalism creates redundancy, and here, the fact that states have the ability to enforce it as well, absent federal preemption, provides an additional layer of safeguards around what really Section 3...
Yeah, and I'll ask you about the history when I get a chance again. Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Justice Thomas? Justice Alito?
Suppose there's a country that proclaims again and again and again that the United States is its biggest enemy, and suppose that the President of the United States, for diplomatic reasons, think that it's in the best interests of the United States to provide funds or release funds so that they can be used by that country. Could a state determine that that person has given aid and comfort to the enemy and therefore keep that person off the ballot?
No, Your Honor. This court has never interpreted the aid and comfort language, which also is present in the treason clause. But commentators have suggested, it's been rarely applied because treason prosecutions are so rare, but commentators have suggested that, first of all, that aid and comfort really only applies in the context of a declared war, or at least an adversarial relationship where there is, in fact, a war between two countries. And second, the intent standard would do a lot of work there, because under Section 3, whatever the underlying conduct is, engaging in insurrection or aid and comfort has to be done with the intent to further the unlawful purpose of the insurrection or to aid the enemies in their pursuit of war against the United States.
Now, let me come back to the question of what we would do if different states had adjudicated the question of whether former President Trump is an insurrectionist using a different record, different rulings on the admissibility of evidence, perhaps different standards of proof. Then what would we do?
Ultimately, this court would, first of all, if there were deficiencies in the record, the court could either refuse to hear the case or it could decide on the basis of deficiencies of the record.
Well, would we have to decide what is the appropriate rule of evidence that should be applied in this case? Would we have to decide what is the appropriate standard of proof? Would we give any deference to these findings by state court judges, some of whom may be elected? Would we have to have our own trial?
No, Your Honor. This court takes the evidentiary record as it's given, and here we have an evidentiary record that all the parties agree is sufficient for a decision in this case. And then, as I discussed earlier, there's a possibility of a Bose Corp independent review of the facts. But ultimately, what we have here is an insurrection that was incited in plain sight.
You're really not answering my question. It's not helpful if you don't do that. Suppose we have two different records, two different bodies of evidence, two different rulings on questions of admissibility, two different standards of proof, two different sets of fact findings by two different judges, or maybe multiple judges in multiple states. Then what do we do?
Well, first, this court would set the legal standard, and then it would decide which view of the record was correct, I think, under that. If this court had two cases,
which view of what record?
Which record? If this court had two cases before it, and both of the records were sufficient insofar as both sides had the opportunity to present their case and the essential facts in the record that everyone agreed was sufficient for decision, then this court would have to look at the evidence presented and decide which holding was correct, and then decide that issue for the country. And certainly here, when there is a complete record, lower courts then will be applying that decision, and I think it's unlikely that any court would say, we're going to reach a different decision than the U.S. Supreme Court did, particularly if the court relies on the facts, the indisputable facts of what President Trump said on video and in his Twitter feed, which is really the essence of our case here.
Well, you had an expert, let's just take that example, had an expert testify about the meaning of what President Trump said. But do you think it's possible that a different state court would apply Daubert differently and say that this person should not be allowed to express an expert opinion on that question? You think that's beyond the realm of imagination?
Not at all, Your Honor. 2 points on that. Number one, President Trump didn't appeal the admission of that evidence in this case. But number two, the second point is that Professor Simi really, he didn't opine on the meaning of President Trump's words. He opined on the effect that those words had on violent extremists. And the essence of his testimony was built around videotaped statements of President Trump himself, encouraging, inciting, and praising political violence.
I'm not taking a position one way or the other about whether the expert's testimony should have been admitted or anything like that, or the meaning of President Trump's words. I'm just trying to get you to grapple with what some people have seen as the consequences of the argument that you're advancing, which is that there will be conflicts in decisions among the states, that different states will disqualify different candidates. But I'm not getting a whole lot of help from you about how this would not be an unmanageable situation.
If this court writes an opinion affirming on the basis of the indisputable facts of what President Trump said on January 6th and in the weeks leading up to it, and his virtual confession on Twitter after the fact, then it would be reversible error for any other state to conclude otherwise on that question of federal law, or at the very least, this court could address that when those issues come up, but it seems unlikely.
Justice Sotomayor?
There's two sides to the other side's position. The first is that it's not self-executing. I want to put that aside. Deal with if we were to hold that states don't have the right to enforce or create a cause of action in this situation. They want the flip to say that no, but even Congress can't do it because they need implementing legislation. Address that argument. Because assume we rule that states don't have it, what would you have us say for the other side of the argument? One of my colleagues says you need, or not then Chief Justice, but Circuit Court Justice Chase said, which is that somehow you need implementing legislation, like the 1870 Act. You seem to say that's not true because they could decide not to seat seat a candidate, et cetera. So I don't know that legislation's necessary.
And certainly there are historical examples of members of Congress under Congress's Article 1 power to judge the qualifications of its members, of members of Congress refusing to seat ineligible candidates under Section 3 who have won election. In the context of the presidency, I think it would create a number of really difficult issues if the court says there's no procedure for determining President Trump's eligibility until after the election. And then what happens when members of Congress on January 6th, when they count the electoral votes, say we're not going to count electoral votes cast for President Trump because he's disqualified under Section 3 under the Electoral Count Reform Act. A number of the amicus briefs, such as those of Professor Ginsburg, Hassan, and Foley, have made the point that that is kind of a disenfranchisement and constitutional crisis in the making, and is all the more reason to address those issues now in a judicial process on a full evidentiary record so that everybody can have certainty on those issues before they go to the polls.
Justice Kagan?
Mr. Murray, you relied on the state's extensive powers under the Electors Clause. You talked about the states having a role in enacting, typical ballot access provisions. I guess, it strikes me that we've put some limits on that, and I'll just give you Anderson versus Celebrezzi as an example of that, where we said, in fact, states are limited in who they can take off a ballot, and that was a case about minor party candidates. But the reason was that one state's decision to take a candidate off the ballot affects everybody else's rights. And we talked about the pervasive national interest in the selection of candidates for national office. We talked about how an individual state's decision would have an impact beyond its own borders. So if that goes for minor political party candidates, why doesn't it go a fortiori for the situation in this case?
Well, certainly constitutional principles like Section 3 apply to everybody, but in Celebrezzi, the issue there was a First Amendment question. And certainly there's no doubt that states' exercise of their power under Article 2 is constrained by First Amendment principles. And in that case, the state law deadlines for when a minor party candidate got on the ballot just came too soon to be reactive to what major parties had done and therefore risk disenfranchising people who were disillusioned with who the major parties had picked. And it raised First Amendment problems. Here, there's no real First Amendment problem, and a state is just trying to enforce an existing qualification that's baked into our constitutional fabric.
Yeah, I guess, it did come up in the First Amendment, but there's a broader principle there, and it's a broader principle about who has power over certain things in our federal system. And within our federal system, states have great power over many different areas, but that there's some broader principle about that there are certain national questions where states are not the repository of authority. And I took a lot, First Amendment, not First Amendment, a lot of Anderson's reasoning is really about that. Like, what's a state doing deciding who gets to, who other citizens get to vote for president?
Colorado is not deciding who other states get to vote for president. It's deciding how to assign its own electors under its Article 2 power. And the Constitution grants them that broad power.
Well, but the effect of that is obvious, yes?
No, Your Honor, because different states can have different procedures. Some states may allow insurrectionists to be on the ballot. They may say, we're not looking past the papers. We're not going to look into federal constitutional questions. It's the sort of, even in this election cycle, there are candidates who are on the ballot in some states, even though they're not natural-born citizens, and off the ballot in other states. And that's just a function of states' power to enforce, to preserve their own electors and avoid disenfranchisement of their own citizens.
Thank you.
Justice Gorsuch?
I haven't had a chance to talk about the officer point, and I just want to give you an opportunity to do that. Mr. Mitchell makes the argument that, particularly in the commissions clause, for example, all officers are to be commissioned by the president. Seems to be all-encompassing, that language. And I'm curious your response to that. And along the way, if you would, I poked a little bit at the difference between office and officer in the earlier discussion, you may recall. But I think one point your friends on the other side would make is, well, that's just how the Constitution uses those terms. So, for example, we know that the President pro tem of the Senate and the Speaker of the House are officers of the United States because the Constitution says they are. But we also know that they don't hold an office under the United States because of the incompatibility clause that says they can't. So maybe the Constitution to us today, to a lay reader, might look a little odd in distinguishing between office and officer. Not prepositions, nouns, but distinction. But maybe that's exactly how it works. Thoughts?
Well, I'd start with the idea that the meaning of officer in the 1780s was the same meaning that it has today, which is a person who holds an office. And certainly in particular contexts like the commissions clause, it appears that that's referring, that is referring to a narrower class of officers, because we know that there are...
Except it says all.
Well, we know that there are classes of officers, like the president pro tem, who don't get their commissions from the president.
Well, that's because the Constitution elsewhere says that.
We know that the appointments clause refers to a class of officers who get their appointment from the Constitution itself, rather than from presidential appointment. People who get their commissions from the president himself are not commissioned by the president. And so if you read the appointments clause in line with the commissions clause, then the commissions clause is really talking about the president's power. If one needs a commission, it's the president who grants it. But I think it's important to bring us back to Section 3 in particular, because that was 80 years...
Before we get to that, though, just the distinction between office and officer, do you agree?
President's power. If one needs a commission, it's the president who grants it. But I think it's important to bring us back to Section 3 in particular, because that was 80 years...
Before we get to that, though, just the distinction between office and officer, do you agree that the Constitution does make that distinction, particularly with respect to the Speaker and President pro tem?
The Constitution makes that distinction, but at least in Section 3, an officer of the United States is a person who swears an oath and holds an office. Now, the President pro tem and the Speaker of the House, they don't swear a constitutional oath in that capacity. They swear a constitutional oath if they are a senator or representative in Congress in that separate non-official capacity. But I think that
You agree they are officers who don't hold an office?
They're officers who may hold an office but don't swear an oath under Article 6 in that official capacity.
Well, how can they hold an office under the incompatibility clause? It says they can't.
Well, I think that's a fair point, and I think that may be an exception to the general rule, and one might consider them perhaps officers of the House and Senate because they are appointed by those bodies and preside over those bodies.
Well, the Constitution says they're officers of the United States. So there are some instances when you have an officer but not an office.
Those may be an exceptional circumstance, but I would...
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Justice Kavanaugh?
The concerns of some question have been the states having such power over a national office. Other questions about the different states having different standards of proof. And they seem underscored by this case, at least the dissenting opinion below. Justice Muir said, I've been involved, quote, I've been involved in the justice system for 33 years now, and what took place here doesn't resemble anything I've seen in a courtroom, end quote. And then added, quote, what transpired in this litigation fell woefully short of what due process demands, end quote. Now, I don't know whether I agree or not. I'm not going to take a position on that. But the fact that someone's complaining not about the bottom line conclusion, but about the very processes that were used in the state would seem to, and that would be permitted, seems to underscore the concerns that have been raised about state power. Just wanted to give you a chance to address that because that was powerful language. Again, not disagreeing about the conclusion, but about the very fairness of the process.
Yes, Your Honor, but that language was, with respect to Justice Moore, just not correct. President Trump had a 5-day trial in this case. He had the opportunity to call any witnesses that he wanted. He had the opportunity to cross-examine our witnesses. He had the opportunity to testify if he wanted to testify. And of course, the process was expedited because ballot access decisions are always on a fast schedule. But in this whole case, from the trial court all the way up to this court, President Trump has never identified a single process other than expert depositions that he wanted to have that he didn't get. He had the opportunity for fact witness depositions. He had the opportunity to call witnesses remotely. He didn't use all of his time at trial. There was ample process here, and this is how ballot access determinations in election cases are decided all the time.
Okay, second question. Some of the rhetoric of your position, I don't think it is your position, but some of the rhetoric of your position seems to suggest unless the states can do this, no one can prevent insurrectionists from holding federal office. But obviously Congress has enacted statutes, including one still in effect, Section 2383 of Title 18 prohibits insurrection. It's a federal criminal statute. And if you're convicted of that, you are, it says, shall be disqualified from holding any office. And so there is a federal statute on the books, but President Trump has not been charged with that. So what are we to make of that?
Two things, Your Honor. Section 2383 was initially enacted about 6 years before Section 3. It wasn't meant as implementing legislation related to Section 3. And I would emphasize that by the time that Section 3 was ratified, most Confederates had already received criminal pardons.
I guess the question's a little bit different, which is if the concern you have, which I understand, is that insurrectionists should not be able to hold federal office, there is a tool to ensure that that does not happen, namely federal prosecution of insurrectionists. And if convicted, Congress made clear you are automatically barred from holding a federal office. That tool exists, you agree, and could be used, but has not, could be used against someone who committed insurrection. You agree with that?
That's absolutely right, Your Honor. But I would just make the point that the framers of Section 3 clearly understood that criminal prosecutions weren't sufficient because oftentimes insurrectionists go unpunished, as was the case in the Civil War, and that the least we can do is impose a civil disqualification penalty so that even if we don't have the stomach to throw someone in jail.
Well, they had the quo warranto provision that was in effect then from 1870 until 1948, but then obviously that dropped out and hasn't been seen as necessary since then. Last question, in trying to figure out what Section 3 means, and kind of to the extent it's elusive language or vague language, what about the idea that we should think about democracy, think about the right of the people to elect candidates of their choice, of letting the people decide, because your position has the effect of disenfranchising voters to a significant degree. And should that be something, does that come in when we think about should we read Section 3 this way or read it that way? What about the background principle, if you agree, of democracy?
I'd like to make 3 points on that, Justice Kavanaugh. The first is that constitutional safeguards are for the purpose of safeguarding our democracy, not just for the next election cycle, but for generations to come. And second, Section 3 is designed to protect our democracy in that very way. The framers of Section 3 knew from painful experience that those who had violently broken their oaths to the Constitution couldn't be trusted to hold power again because they could dismantle our constitutional democracy from within. And so they created a democratic safety valve. President Trump can go ask Congress to give him amnesty by a 2/3 vote. But unless he does that, our Constitution protects us from insurrectionists. And third, this case illustrates the danger of refusing to apply Section 3 as written, because the reason we're here is that President Trump tried to disenfranchise 80 million Americans who voted against him, and the Constitution doesn't require that he be given another chance.
Thank you.
Justice Barrett?
So the general rule is that absent rare circumstances, state courts and federal courts share authority. State courts have authority to enforce the Constitution, but there are certain limits to that, certain situations in which the Constitution itself preempts the state's ability to resolve constitutional questions. And you know, Tarbell's case is one, and you said earlier that once a president is elected, you accepted that a state couldn't do anything about that. Like Colorado couldn't enact its own, say, quo warranto provision and then use it to get the Secretary of State or the president or anyone else out of office. And I assume that's because of this principle of structural preemption. Am I right?
Yes, Your Honor.
Okay. So I just want to clarify what that means for your argument. That means that your eggs are really in the basket of the Electors Clause, really in the Article 1 basket, because you're saying that even though all of the questions that people have been asking have suggested that there's a problem with giving a single state the authority to render a decision that would have an effect on a national election. But you're saying that those structural concerns, which might otherwise lead to the kind of result that you would accept after someone is in office, are overcome by the Electors Clause.
Absolutely. States run presidential elections. That's very clear from Article 2. Once states have selected the electors and the electors have voted, states have no more power over the candidate who has been then nominated for president. But until then, the states do have the power to adjudicate those issues.
Thank you.
Justice Jackson?
So when I asked you earlier about the uniformity concern and the troubling potential disuniformity of having different states enforce Section 3 with respect to presidential elections, you seem to point to history in a certain way. You said, I think, that the framers actually envisioned states enforcing Section 3, at least in some circumstances where there were insurgents and Confederates. And I guess in my view of the history, I'm wondering really whether presidential elections were such a circumstance, that the framers actually envisioned states enforcing Section 3 with respect to presidential elections as opposed to senatorial elections, representatives, the sort of more local concerns. So can you speak to the argument that really Section 3 was about preventing the South from rising again in the context of these sort of local elections as opposed to focusing on the presidency?
Well, 2 points on that, Justice Jackson. First is that, as I discussed earlier, there isn't the same history of states regulating ballot access at this time. So ballot access rules to restrict presidential candidates wouldn't have existed. They wouldn't have been raised one way or another.
Right, but I'm not making a distinction between ballot access and anything else.
Understood, but the more broad point I want to make is that what is very clear from the history is that the framers were concerned about charismatic rebels who might rise through the ranks up to and including the presidency of the United States.
But then why didn't they put the word president in the very enumerated list in Section 3? The thing that really is troubling to me is I totally understand your argument, but they were listing people that were barred, and president is not there. And so I guess that just makes me worry that maybe they weren't focusing on the president. And, for example, the fact that electors of vice president and president are there suggests that really what they thought was, if we're worried about the charismatic person, we're going to bar insurrectionist electors, and therefore that person is never going to rise.
This came up in the debates in Congress over Section 3, where Reverdy Johnson said, why haven't you included president and vice president in the language? And Senator Morrill responds, we have. Look at the language, any office under the United States.
Yes, but doesn't that at least
suggest ambiguity. And this sort of ties into Justice Kavanaugh's point. In other words, we had a person right there at the time saying what I'm saying. The language here doesn't seem to include president. Why is that? And so if there's an ambiguity, why would we construe it to, as Justice Kavanaugh pointed out, against democracy?
Well, Reverdy Johnson came back and agreed with that reading. Any office is clear. The Constitution says about 20 times.
No, I'm not going to that. So let me just say, so your point is that there's no ambiguity. With having a list and not having president in it, with having a history that suggests that they were really focused on local concerns in the South, with this conversation where the legislators actually discussed what looked like an ambiguity. You're saying there is no ambiguity in Section 3?
Let me take the point specifically about electors and senators, if I might, because I think that's important. Presidential electors were not covered because they don't hold an office. They vote. And this
No, I'm talking about the barred office part of this.
Exactly. So the barred offices, if you want to include everybody, first you have to specify presidential electors because they're not offices, so they wouldn't fall under any office. Second of all, senators and representatives don't hold office either. The Constitution tells us that under the incompatibility clause and refers to them as holding seats, not offices. And so you want to make sure that there's no doubt that senators and representatives are covered. Given that the Constitution suggests otherwise, you have to include them. The Constitution says the presidency holds an office, as do members of this court. And so other high offices, the president, vice president, members of this court.
All right, let me ask you, I appreciate that argument. If we think that the states can't enforce this provision for whatever reason in this context, in the presidential context, what happens next in this case? I mean, is it done?
If this court concludes that Colorado did not have the authority to exclude President Trump from the presidential ballot on procedural grounds, I think this case would be done, but I think it could come back with a vengeance because ultimately members of Congress may have to make the determination after a presidential election if President Trump wins about whether or not he's disqualified from office and whether to count votes cast for him under the Electoral Count Reform Act. So President Trump himself urges this court in the first few pages of his brief to resolve the issues on the merits, and we think that the court should do so as well.
And there's no federal litigation, you would say?
Well, that's correct, because there is no federal procedure for deciding these issues, short of a criminal prosecution.
Thank you.
Thank you, counsel. Ms. Stevenson?
Mr. Chief Justice.
Mr. Anderson. No, Stevenson. That's right. I'm sorry.
Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court. Exercising its far-reaching powers under the Electors Clause, Colorado's legislature specifically directed Colorado's courts to resolve any challenges to the listing of any candidate on the presidential primary ballot before Coloradans cast their votes. Despite this law, petitioner contends that Colorado must put him on the ballot because of the possibility there would be a supermajority act of Congress to remove his legal disability. Under this theory, Colorado and every other state would have to indulge this possibility, not just for the primary, but through the general election and up to the moment that an ineligible candidate was sworn into office. Nothing in the Constitution strips the states of their power to direct presidential elections in this way. This case was handled capably and efficiently by the Colorado courts under a process that we've used to decide ballot challenges for more than a century. And as everyone agrees, the court now has the record that it needs to resolve these important issues. I welcome your questions.
Is there an express provision with respect to that defines what a qualified candidate is?
No, Your Honor, there's not an express provision. When the Colorado Supreme Court looked at this, they looked at the need to be qualified, plus the fact that this part was...
So what does it say then? If it's not express, how do we get to this issue of qualified candidate?
What the Colorado Supreme Court did, and let me, if I could have a standing objection, I do want to make the argument that you shouldn't review the court's statutory interpretation.
No, I'm just looking at the statute.
Right. What the court did was to say that we have three important provisions in this section that show that candidates have to be qualified. First, it requires that under 1203 2A, that a political party that wants to participate has to have a qualified candidate. It also looked at the fact that comparable write-in candidates also had to be qualified.
No, but this isn't a write-in candidate, so we're actually talking about the participation of a political party, right? We're not talking about the participation of a candidate.
Sure, I think that the fact that the write-in candidate also had to be qualified was confirmatory of the fact that the political party candidate also had to be qualified, and it would be otherwise incongruous to read those things differently.
So how is Section 3 a qualification?
Under the reasoning of the Colorado Supreme Court,
no, just on its face.
A candidate must meet all the criteria for eligibility, and I don't perceive any distinction between meeting the eligibility criteria and not being disqualified. I just don't see any meaningful difference between those two things.
Thank you.
You represent the Secretary of State, right?
That's correct, Your Honor.
If you're the Secretary of State somewhere and someone comes in and says, I think this candidate should be disqualified, what do you do next?
Administratively, and what the Deputy Elections Director testified to at the hearing, is that if they obtain objective knowable information, the Secretary can act on that and inform the candidate.
So the Secretary at first decides whether that's objective knowable information?
In some instances. In this case, the challenge was actually brought before the candidate's paperwork had even been submitted, and because there had already been a challenge asserted and put into the proper court procedure, the Secretary didn't even make that determination because she didn't have the paperwork.
Well, what in another case where that wasn't the procedure that was filed, somebody comes in, maybe they've got a stack of papers saying, here's why I think this person is guilty of insurrection. It's not a big insurrection, something that, happened down the street, but they say this is still an insurrection. I don't know what the standard is for when it arises to that.
I think anything that even presented that level of controversy about one person having a set of facts that they said prove this would send this case to the 113 procedure that we use to resolve ballot challenge issues like that. And if another elector or the individual who brought the information didn't want to bring it, the Secretary herself could bring that action.
Is there a provision for judicial review of the Secretary of State's action, both in Colorado and perhaps what you know about other states?
Well, certainly in Colorado, if any action that the Secretary takes that anyone wants to challenge, they can use the 113 process to do so. I think states have varying degrees of that. There's certainly other states that allow versions of that, and then I don't know whether there are others that don't. I certainly know that there are some that do.
I think we're told that there are states that do not provide for any judicial review of a Secretary of State's determination. Is that incorrect?
No, I think that's right. And I think there are some states that actually have no mechanism to come to, I think, Justice Kagan's point, or there are some states that don't have any mechanism to exclude a disqualified candidate from the ballot at all. And I do want to speak to that for just a minute about the actual
Would that be constitutional if the Secretary of State's determination was final?
I think so under Article 2, the Electors Clause, Your Honor, that would be constitutional. States get very broad authority to determine how to run their presidential elections.
Could a state enact a statute that provides different rules of evidence and different rules of procedure and different standards of proof for this type of proceeding than for other civil proceedings?
Yes, Your Honor, I believe it could, under the same Electors Clause power.
That issue would be determined under perhaps a different constitutional provision like the Due Process Clause, correct?
Correct. The bounds of the Electors Clause are other constitutional constraints, which would include due process, equal protection, First Amendment.
What's the due process right? Does the candidate have a due process right? What's the liberty interest?
I think it's not very precisely defined in the case law, but I think there is a recognition that there is a liberty interest of a candidate, and there is some due process interest in being able to access the ballot.
I thought that was for voters. You think for the candidate too, that it would be taking something away from the candidate?
Certainly, yes, and I think a lot of times you see that in the First Amendment context where candidates can have an issue about being on the ballot, but it's sort of a hybrid, oftentimes First Amendment, 14th Amendment, qualifications clause, all discussed together.
Let me ask you a question about, just follow up to Justice Alito. These decisions might be made different ways in different states. Maybe a Secretary of State makes it in one state with very little process, or a process more like Colorado's could be followed by others. Would our standard of review of the record vary depending on the procedure employed by the state?
I think this court has tremendous discretion to decide its standard of review, and it might be based on the process that was employed by an individual state. I think you could exercise the independent review of Bose Corp that Mr. Murray talked about, or you could give deference where you have a full-blown proceeding like the one here that had all the protections of rules of evidence and cross-examination and things like that.
I'm sorry. You think we should give deference in reviewing the factual record, the legal conclusions? What? In other words, we shouldn't undertake a de novo review.
I don't think the review should be de novo. However, I am amenable to the suggestion that the court would do the Bose Corp type independent review that might provide greater certainty to states around the country as to what the court's position is on the factual record in this case.
Of course, if it were not de novo review, we could reach disparate results even on the same record, right?
I think that's possible.
I take it your position is that this disqualification is really the same as any other disqualification, age or residence or what have you.
That's correct.
And what if I were to push back on that and say, well, this disqualification, number one, it's in the 14th Amendment, and the point of the 14th Amendment was to take away certain powers from the states. Number two, Section 3 itself gives Congress a very definite role, which Mr. Mitchell says is interfered with by the ability of states to take somebody off the ballot. Maybe number three, it's just more complicated and more contested, and if you want, more political. And why don't all of those things make a difference in our thinking about this qualification as opposed to any other?
And so, Your Honor, I think the trouble with the categorizing the insurrection issue as necessarily more difficult is it's just an assumption that's coming up, I think, because of this case. And again, back to the Chief Justice's point, we could have a very easy case under the 14th Amendment with an avowed insurrectionist who, came in and wrote on his paperwork, I engaged in an insurrection in violation of the 14th Amendment, and it would be an open and shut case as to whether or not that person would meet the qualifications to be on the Colorado ballot. With respect to your other questions about the 14th Amendment, my positions are based on the assumption that under the 14th Amendment, the states have the power to enforce Section 3, just like they do other presidential qualifications, and I would defer to the electors' arguments on those points.
Suppose a state that does recognize non-mutual collateral estoppel makes a determination using whatever procedures it decides to adopt that a particular candidate is an insurrectionist. Could that have a cascading effect? And so the decision by a court in one state, the decision by a single judge whose factual findings are given deference, maybe an elected trial judge, would have potentially an enormous effect on the candidates who run for president across the country. Is that something we should be concerned about?
I think you should be concerned about it, Your Honor, but I think the concern is not as high as maybe it's made out to be in particularly some of the amicus briefs. And again, under Article 2, there is a huge amount of disparity in candidates that end up on the ballot on different states in every election. Just this election, there's a candidate who Colorado excluded from the primary ballot who is on the ballot in other states, even though he is not a natural-born citizen. And that's just that's a feature of our process. It's not a bug. And then I think with respect to the decision-making, and we're here so that this court can give us nationwide guidance on some of the legal principles that are involved. I think that reduces the potential amount of disparity that would arise between the states. And then with respect to the factual record and how that gets issued and implemented, states have processes for this. And I think we need to let that play out and accept that there may be some messiness of federalism here, because that's what the Electors Clause assumes will happen. And if different states apply their principles of collateral estoppel and come to different results, that's okay. And Congress can act at any time if it thinks that it's truly federalism run amok.
Justice Thomas, anything further? Justice Alito?
Well, just one further question, and it's along the same lines of a lot of other questions. We've been told that if what Colorado did here is sustained, other states are going to retaliate, and they're going to potentially exclude another candidate from the ballot. What about that situation?
Your Honor, I think we have to have faith in our system that people will follow their election processes appropriately, that they will take realistic views of what insurrection is under the 14th Amendment. Courts will review those decisions. This court may review some of them, but I don't think that this court should take those threats too seriously in its resolution of this case.
You don't think that's a serious threat?
I think we have processes.
We should proceed on the assumption that it's not a serious threat.
I think we have institutions in place to handle those types of allegations.
What are those institutions?
Our states, their own electoral rules, the administrators who enforce those rules, the courts that will review those decisions, and up to this court to ultimately review that decision.
Justice Sotomayor? Justice Kagan? Justice Kavanaugh? Justice Jackson? Anything further? Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
Rebuttal, Mr. Mitchell?
Both Mr. Murray and Ms. Stevenson rely heavily on the Electors Clause and the authority that it gives the legislature of each state to direct the manner of appointing presidential electors. But that prerogative under Article 2 must be exercised in a manner consistent with other constitutional provisions and restrictions. And Justice Kagan alluded to one of those restrictions that might be imposed by the First Amendment, but there are others. A state cannot use its power under Article 2's Electors Clause to instruct its presidential electors only to vote for white candidates. That would violate the Equal Protection Clause. But nor can it exercise its power in a manner that would violate the constitutional holding of U.S. term limits against Thornton. And they cannot use the Electors Clause as an excuse to impose additional qualifications for the presidency that go beyond what the Constitution enumerates. Line that the candidate has for obtaining a congressional waiver. There has still been no answer from the Anderson litigants on how to distinguish the congressional residency cases, where the courts of appeals, not decisions from this court, but the courts of appeals in applying this court's holding in U.S. term limits have unanimously disapproved state laws requiring congressional candidates to show that they inhabit the state from which they seek election prior to Election Day. And there still, in our view, is no possible way to distinguish those from the situation below in the Colorado Supreme Court. Mr. Murray also invoked the de facto officer doctrine as a possible way to mitigate the dramatic consequences that would follow from a decision of this court that rejects the rationale of Griffin's case and that also agrees with Mr. Murray's contentions that President Trump is disqualified from holding office on account of the events of January 6th and that he's covered by Section 3 as an officer of the United States. This court's recent decisions in Lucia and Arthrex held that officers who were unconstitutionally appointed under Article 2 and that made decisions under the APA that were attacked as invalid, those decisions were still vacated, and this court did not use any variant of the de facto officer doctrine to salvage the decisions that were made by these unconstitutionally appointed officers. There is no way to escape the conclusion that if this court rejects Griffin's case and also agrees with Mr. Murray's construction of Section 3, that every executive action taken by the Trump administration during its last 2 weeks in office is vulnerable to attack under the APA. And further, that if President Trump is reelected and sworn in as the next president, that any executive action that he takes could be attacked in federal court by anyone who continues to believe that President Trump is barred from office under Section 3. I'm happy to answer any other questions that the court may have.
Thank you, counsel.
Thank you.
The case is submitted.
The Honorable Court is now adjourned until Friday, the 16th of February at 10 o'clock.
You've been listening to the U.S. Supreme Court hearing arguments on whether former President Trump could be barred from re-election under the 14th Amendment. Trump's attorney argued the former president is not covered under Section 3 as an elected official, claiming also that he's not an officer of the United States. He also said that Section 3 can't apply to a candidate, only to those who hold office. He said that if the U.S. Supreme Court affirms the Colorado Supreme Court's decision, which removed Trump from the ballot in that state, that it would, quote, take away votes of potentially tens of millions of Americans. The plaintiff's attorney argued that President Trump disqualified himself by trying to disrupt the peaceful transfer of power by engaging in insurrection against the Constitution. He says that ultimately is what this court is going to decide, and it's the question of whether Trump's eligibility holds amid that issue for the country. So let's bring in senior national correspondent Terry Moran outside the Supreme Court, ABC News Supreme Court contributor Kate Shaw, and ABC News executive editorial producer John Santucci. Terry, what stood out to you from these arguments? Do you think you got any clues from which way the justices could be leaning by some of their questions here?
You know, Diane, in general, it's tough to read the tea leaves. You know, the questions sometimes are asked by justices to explore issues, but I think it felt pretty much to me like there is a strong majority against Colorado's position that it can disqualify Donald Trump from the ballot there. Now, how they get there, they might differ. And if you have been listening from the beginning of these arguments, good on you, because a great deal of what the justices did was the work of justices. It seemed they drilled down on two things. One that everybody can understand, one that lawyers and judges understand. And that's the one they spend the most time on. How does this work? That was clearly the question again and again in various forms. If Colorado can do this, by what standard? Under what burden of proof? If Colorado does it one way and somebody else does it another way, are we supposed to accept that? How is a system where individual states can declare someone an insurrectionist by whatever means? In Maine, it was the Secretary of State. Just bang, you're an insurrectionist, you're off the ballot. And in Colorado, there was a 5-day trial. What's the standard? How do we review it? What's expected of us? The other question that they were concerned about was democracy. And you could hear that, especially in Justice Kavanaugh's question. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson followed up on it, which is that why should one state be able to decide for the rest of the country, basically the presidential election? First, by means of taking those electoral votes that state has away from one candidate. Second, by setting a precedent that other states might be able to follow on. And the answer from the lawyer for Colorado, well, the law, the 14th Amendment that we're dealing with is designed to protect elections from insurrectionists. And if it's messy, essentially, I mean, I think he was pinned and wriggling several times under fierce questioning, but his basic answer was, this is what the Constitution contemplates in order to protect the democracy from insurrectionists. And so part of the argument, very dense legalistic stuff, part of the argument, basic democracy stuff.
Yeah, we heard the Solicitor General there calling it the messiness of federalism and how that's sort of part of the system. Kate, the justices, though, they also grilled Trump's attorney on whether Section 3 is self-executing. Can you explain why that's so important to this case?
Absolutely. And I would agree with Terry in general. You know, this was not the hardest of arguments to read in terms of the tone and tenor of the justices. The argument went, maybe not surprisingly, very well for Donald Trump. It does seem as though there is a strong majority, maybe even close to a unanimous court to rule for him on some grounds, although I think we do still have to wait and see what grounds. In terms of self-executing, right, the question here is, can Colorado just do this? Or does Congress have to pass a statute basically implementing the disqualification in Article 3, in the Section 3 of the 14th Amendment? And Congress hasn't passed such a statute here. So can Colorado essentially initiate this action? And there's some, you know, there's an early case decided by a single Supreme Court justice, not the full court, suggesting that legislation actually is necessary to implement Section 3. Actually, I think Trump's lawyer didn't solely rely on that case. It's called Griffin's case, in part because there's other precedent pointing in the other direction, but did say a combination of that early case and the fact that Congress, after the Civil War, after the passage of the 14th Amendment, did pass legislation actually implementing, with respect to Confederate rebels, aspects of the disqualification, and then also overrode using a different part of Section 3 that allows Congress to remove the disqualification. So Congress did that too. So the argument was really Congress did a lot in the early days to implement Section 3, and Congress hasn't done anything here. And Colorado can't act unless Congress does first. So that's essentially the self-execution argument. I think the justices were interested in it. I'm not sure if that's the way they will go, but a combination of that argument and an argument about the kind of practical consequences of letting a single state make such a dramatic change in the availability of candidates to voters kind of nationwide, or, the availability of the office of presidency to candidates seemed like something that justices were really troubled by.
And John, you had mentioned it was interesting to hear some of the democratically appointed justices, particularly Ketanji Brown Jackson, talking about, in a sense, seeing why this section of the 14th Amendment may not apply to the president.
And pointing out that it troubled her at one point that the president, the office of the president, wasn't mentioned in there, that according to their reading of it, it more focused on these electors that could be empowered by southern states after the Civil War, especially to, cause an insurrection, to take over the government, to influence in some way, not so much that one person, being the president, would suddenly have this grand power over all of the federal government. I think, for anybody that was expecting today to be, let's just say a reanalysis of January 6th, the day, and the insurrection, you didn't get that. What we all got, and Kate and Terry, I'm happy to visit you in Supreme Court land. Usually we don't do this, but the reality is that today was really just a parsing through of the 14th Amendment, of the Constitution, and anybody that thought you'd get the fireworks of what we usually see around anything involving Donald Trump in January 6th and the violence that happened up at the Capitol, this was not the day for that.
All right, Terry, John, Kate, thank you so much. And keep it right here. We will have continuing updates on ABC News Live throughout the day and more on this case as well. The news never stops. Stay with us.
Whenever news breaks,
we are here in Israel, a nation at war after that brutal surprise attack by Hamas.
On the ground in Ukraine, reporting from Lewiston, Maine.
The scene of a horrific mass shooting.
ABC News Live is right there everywhere.
From the scene of that deadly missile strike in Dnipro, Ukraine.
Reporting from the earthquake in Turkey.
In Rolling Fork, this tornado tore through this little town.
From the most devastating disaster in Hawaii.
From Charleston, South Carolina, on the 2024 campaign trail.
In Iceland, let's go.
Traveling with the president in Mexico City.
Wherever the story.
From the front lines, from southern Israel.
Outside the Gaza Strip.
In Beirut.
From the FBI.
Reporting from the nurses on the picket line.
Here at 10 Downing Street in London.
Streaming live to you.
Wherever the story is.
Wherever the story is.
Wherever the story is. We're going to take you there.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live. Streaming free everywhere. America's #1 streaming news.
I have a point of contact.
They're expecting us?
This is our secret world we have.
Do you think we're going to be safe?
I don't know.
This is my pen. Inside that pen is a slice of human brain.
These are assassinations, and people are going to be murdered.
Definitely.
There's really no telling what some of them will do.
I'm in.
Oh my God! It's happening everywhere and anywhere.
Wow. The clock is ticking. That urgent search
For those 5 people on board the missing submersible.
carrying tourists to the wreckage of the Titanic.
What happened to this submersible?
Titanic still fascinates people today.
What is the lesson of Titanic? Listen to the warnings.
It was almost as if the Titanic claimed 5 more victims.
Was there any warning before the submersible actually imploded?
Fatal dive to the Titanic. Tonight at 8/7 Central on ABC. Why do so many people start their day here?
From ABC News, this is Start Here.
To be in the know and get a different take on the day's top stories.
A lot of news today, so let's get into it.
Listen now to the Daily News Podcast honored with 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards and see why the New York Times calls it a news podcast worth listening to. Start Here, ABC News. Make it your daily first listen.
Now, that's a part of the story I bet you didn't see coming.
Wherever you get your podcasts, Start Here.
First thing in the morning.
There's a lot going on.
Yet another avalanche warning that's up.
To catch you up with what happened overnight.
A dangerous ice storm is impacting the morning commute.
What's happening today? Escalating tensions in the Middle East.
What people are talking about, the migrant crisis.
Fast, straightforward.
With some fun in between.
How does billionaire sound?
Sounds good to me. The moose started chasing a dog.
First thing in the morning.
America This Morning
America's #1 early morning news.
on ABC News Live.
Whenever, wherever news breaks, it's so important to always remember
that lives are changed. Here in London, in Buffalo, Uvalde, Texas, Edinburgh, Scotland.
Reporting from Rolling Fork, Mississippi.
Ukrainian refugees here in Warsaw. We're heading to a small community outside of Mexico City.
Getting you behind the stories as they happen. ABC News Live Prime. We'll take you there.
Stream ABC News Live weeknights wherever you stream your news. Only on ABC News Live.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, former President Trump is speaking after a Supreme Court hearing to discuss the issue of whether or not he can be banned from the ballot in 2024. Let's listen.
Supreme Court, it's a beautiful thing to watch in many respects. It's unfortunate that we have to go through a thing like that. I consider it to be more election interference by the Democrats. It's so unnecessary. So I just say that in watching the Supreme Court today, I thought it's a very beautiful process. I hope that democracy in this country will continue because right now we have a very, very tough situation with all of the radical left ideas, with the weaponization of politics. They weaponize it like it's never been weaponized before. It's totally illegal, but they do it anyway. And it has to stop. Every one of the court cases that I'm involved, every single one, civil, whether it's the attorney generals or the district attorneys. You look at Fani in Georgia. They had many meetings with the White House and with the DOJ. They went there, 8-hour meetings. That was all staged. That was a phony hoax. And now you look at it, and it is a phony hoax. And hopefully that case will be dismissed in short order. It's a disgrace to this country. But they work together with the Justice Department and the White House, and not supposed to do that. Every one of these cases you see comes out of the White House. It comes out of Biden. It's election interference, and it's really very sad. I thought the presentation today was a very good one. I think it was well received. I hope it was well received. You have millions of people that are out there wanting to vote, and they happen to want to vote for me or the Republican Party, or whatever you want to, however you want to phrase it. But I'm the one running, and we are leading in every poll. We're leading in the local polls, in the state polls, and we're leading in the swing state polls, and we're leading very big in the national polls. So it's been a very great honor. We love the country. I think the reason we have such big leads, frankly, is that they loved 4 years of us compared to the 3 years plus the 3 years that they've gone with Biden, where you have open borders, you have crime. Nobody's ever seen crime like this, what's happening. And now the crime is being committed, much of it by the migrants that have come in illegally to our country. I was wondering about that. I said, you know, a lot of these people come out of jails, they come out of mental institutions, they come out of places that you don't want to know about. We don't even know where they come from. We don't know who they are, where they are. They're being dumped in from mental institutions, from prisons and jails. And many terrorists are coming into our country. We're going to be paying a big price. They have to stop it. They have to close the border. By the way, the president can do it just by saying, I want the border closed. I closed the border. We had the safest border in the history of our country. Now we have the most unsafe border in the history of the world. There's never been a country with a border like this, not even a third world country. So we are, again, we're going out to Nevada right now. We'll be out there. Some of you are going to be out there with us. Otherwise, your colleagues.
You're watching
will
former
be.
President Trump reacting to a Supreme Court hearing, arguments over whether he can be blocked from the ballot for his role in January 6th. The 14th Amendment bars anyone who's previously taken the oath of office from holding office again if they've engaged in insurrection or rebellion against the Constitution. A watchdog group representing voters in Colorado sued, alleging Trump's actions surrounding the attack on the Capitol breached that clause, and the Colorado Supreme Court agreed, removing Trump from the state's ballot. Similar efforts have also unfolded in more than a dozen states, with 2 blocking Trump from their ballots and others allowing him to stay on. Now the Supreme Court of the country could decide once and for all whether the former president is eligible for re-election. Senior national correspondent Terry Moran joins me outside the Supreme Court now, along with ABC News political director Rick Klein and ABC News Supreme Court contributor Kate Shaw for more. Rick, what do you make of Trump's response to this, coming right out of this hearing?
So I want to thank everybody.
First, a couple of quick fact checks. This is now veered into becoming a very political speech. A lot of the big talking points, just including a false claim that he closed the border where Biden didn't. But on the merits of the case, he also veered into some severe misinformation by saying falsely that the Biden White House is directing all of these legal cases. That is not the case. I think we've learned about the separations that are here, and the Biden White House has kept quite a bit of distance from all these cases. This emanated directly out of Colorado. I think he also is presuming that the Supreme Court will side with him, as our folks have analyzed, I think, correctly today. It does appear the court is leaning that way, but he's now using it as the political forum that in some ways he's entitled to. I mean, this is the former president speaking, and he is very much lashing back at a lot of the building wave of all these different legal cases against him.
Terry, one of the questions before the court is whether they can decide this issue broadly for all the states, or whether this is a case-by-case issue. I want to play a clip of Justice Alito addressing that with former President Trump's attorney.
Possibility that other states would say, using their choice of law rules and their rules on collateral estoppel, that there's non-mutual collateral estoppel against former President Trump. And so the decision of the Colorado Supreme Court could effectively decide this question for many other states, perhaps all other states. Could it not lead to that consequence?
I don't think so, because Colorado law does not recognize non-mutual collateral estoppel, and I believe the preclusive effect of the decision would be determined by Colorado law rather than the law of another state. But I think your question, Justice Alito, gives rise to an even greater concern, because if this decision does not have preclusive effect in other lawsuits, it opens the possibility that a different factual record could be developed.
So, Terry, what happens if the Supreme Court decides something pertaining to Colorado, but then a case in a different state finds a different set of facts? For example, if one decides that Donald Trump did participate in insurrection and another finds that he didn't.
Right, well, they were clearly concerned about the possibility of chaos in the states around this issue. You already have states doing it differently, coming to different conclusions. I am honestly going to leave the issue of mutuality of collateral estoppel. I'm going to leave that estoppel to Kate Shaw. But what I can say, based on what we just heard from Justice Alito and Donald Trump's lawyer, is the concern on the court that they could be faced with, that they don't come down with a decision one way or another. The 14th Amendment can be applied in this way to Donald Trump or not. They're going to be confronted with that parade of horribles that Justice Alito just pointed out. Other states are going to follow suit. Other states might be compelled through litigation, that's what collateral estoppel is, to follow Colorado's action. And as a result, this could be a patchwork. This could be an unintended parade of consequences that no one wants. I think the court is looking for, sounded to me like the justices were looking for, a way to come together to decide this issue for once and for all.
Kate, Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson also questioned Trump's attorney on whether they accept that the January 6th attack amounted to an insurrection. Let's listen to that moment.
The Colorado Supreme Court concluded that the violent attempts of the petitioner's supporters in this case to halt the count on January 6th qualified as an insurrection, as defined by Section 3. And I read your opening brief to accept that those events counted as an insurrection, but then your reply seemed to suggest that they were not. So what is your position as to that?
We never accepted or conceded in our opening brief that this was an insurrection. What we said in our opening brief was President Trump did not engage in any act that can plausibly be characterized as insurrection.
All right, so why would this not be an insurrection? What is your argument that it's not? Your reply brief says that it wasn't because I think you say it did not involve an organized attempt to overthrow the government. So
that's one of many reasons. But for an insurrection, there needs to be an organized, concerted effort to overthrow the government of the United States through violence. And this
so the point is that a chaotic effort to overthrow the government is not an insurrection?
No, we didn't concede that it's an effort to overthrow the government either, Justice Jackson. Right? None of these criteria were met. This was a riot. It was not an insurrection. The events were shameful, criminal, violent, all of those things, but it did not qualify as insurrection as that term is used in Section 3.
Kate, how fine a line is Trump's attorney walking here? And does it matter that even his admission there that this was shameful and violent clashes with some of what his own client has said on social media and at speaking events?
I thought it was a striking moment, and it certainly may matter politically. As a legal matter, I'm not sure there's that much interest in really probing this question. I was, glad to see Justice Jackson brought it up because it is one of the key questions in the case. Was this an insurrection under the Constitution? Did Trump engage in it? And yet, I think that was one of about 2 exchanges that really went to this question. Both, was this an insurrection, and was the process by which the Colorado trial court made its findings a sufficient process to satisfy the demands of the Constitution? So I don't think that, I imagine if Trump was watching the full 2.5 hours, I doubt he was happy with that response, but it seemed from the perspective of winning the case before the justices like a wise concession for Jonathan Mitchell, Trump's lawyer, to have made. And there were a couple of places where, interestingly, the justices who seemed sympathetic to Trump's arguments were trying to essentially guide Mitchell to making certain kinds of arguments, that the presidency isn't an office, that this early case, Griffin's case, kind of resolves this question of whether Congress needs to pass a statute before a state can disqualify someone. And he was a little resistant to taking some of those routes. I think he thought some of his arguments were stronger than others. But it did make me wonder whether, even if the justices mostly or all, maybe 7 or 8 or even 9 side with President Trump in this case, it may not be a case in which there's a single opinion they all agree on, because there are so many different arguments that were in play, and different justices seem drawn to different arguments along the way.
With the same ruling, but for different reasons. Rick, I want to go to you on the politics, as Kate mentioned, because that's the legal part of this contrast. But of course, all of this is also political. As you just mentioned, we just heard former President Trump addressing this hearing and then immediately going into political arguments as well. The fact that he is calling, people convicted in the January 6th case, J6 hostages, and trying to say that it was no big deal, that it wasn't violent. To have his attorney now saying before the Supreme Court that it was shameful, that it was violent, and so on, does that matter for him politically?
I think only in as much as now Republican primary voters and ultimately voters in the fall tend to care about it. I mean, what he is saying about January 6th is an utter rewriting of history, and it is contradicted by the public record and in many cases his own attorneys. I think much more consequential even than this ruling, which I think is, as Terry and Kate have been covering, it seems like it's fait accompli that he'll remain on the ballot in Colorado, will be how the Supreme Court and how quickly the Supreme Court acts on the immunity claim and some of the other cases that are working their way through. If Donald Trump is still on track to be convicted potentially of a crime before November, I think that's going to be more consequential than this would be. Keep in mind, I mean, even if the justices were to side with Colorado, the Colorado Republican Party has said they'd find a different process. They may revert to a caucus instead of a primary, and this only applies to the primary. So this is not, even if it's a very sweeping ruling that affirms Colorado, this would not deny him the presidency. And I'll tell you, the Biden campaign never assumed that it was. This is not something that folks in and around the Democratic Party have wanted. They haven't particularly welcomed this. I think they'd rather be talking about the other criminal cases, if any cases at all, and make the case against Donald Trump. They recognize that they're going to beat Donald Trump at the ballot box. That's going to happen in November. And yes, some of the messaging around democracy in January 6th, whether or not he is found to have engaged in insurrection by the Supreme Court in this case involving the Colorado Supreme Court's opinion, that is not going to be as material as the political case and the public case that's brought against him this fall.
Kate, the plaintiff's attorney made the case that by Trump's team's logic, Trump would not be allowed to serve as a state judge under the 14th Amendment, but somehow would be allowed to be president. How effective did you find that argument?
It's never been weaponized before. It's totally illegal, but they do it anyway.
Kate.
And it has to stop. In watching.
We may have lost Kate Shaw. Rick, I want to go back to you, though, on this, because we not only are hearing, obviously, a contrast between what Trump's attorney said on the floor and what we've heard him say, but some of his tweets and comments are actually coming into play in this case. They were mentioned in these arguments. How careful does he have to be right now?
Yeah, look, I think anything he says can and will be used against him. and his public comments have not been things that his lawyers would want. And I think the rewriting of history around January 6th, and even in this news conference right now, he talked about the very beautiful things that he put on Twitter on January 6th. Of course, we remember what he actually put out there, and that has come into play in the impeachment trial and the January 6th hearings, and it will almost certainly come into play in the criminal proceedings that are being brought against him by the special counsel as well, including the way that he seemed to egg on the crowd at that speech, and then on Twitter, his long failure to condemn them, and ultimately talking about the beauty with which the support was being expressed. So those things have been factors before, and I'd imagine that they would be again. He doesn't have the same access to social media as he once did, or the same pipelines in some cases, but he still has quite a megaphone. He uses his own social media platform, Truth Social, to spread lies and misinformation about the last election, and again to continue to rewrite, and even in some cases it can be read as threatening potential witnesses. So all of that information is going to be part of the public record that again will play out politically and legally.
Terry, the justices also put the question to the plaintiff's attorney why one state, why Colorado should decide this question for the rest of the country. Let's listen to that moment.
I think that the question that you have to confront is why a single state should decide who gets to be president of the United States. In other words, this question of whether a former president is disqualified for insurrection to be president again is, just say it. It sounds awfully national to me. So whatever means there are to enforce it would suggest that they have to be federal, national means. Why does, if you weren't from Colorado and you were from Wisconsin or you were from Michigan, and it really, what the Michigan Secretary of State did is going to make the difference between, whether candidate A is elected or candidate B is elected. I mean, that seems quite extraordinary, doesn't it?
No, Your Honor, because ultimately it's this court that's going to decide that question of federal constitutional eligibility and settle the issue for the nation. And certainly it's not unusual that questions of national importance come up.
Well, I mean, if we affirmed and we said he was ineligible to be president, yes, maybe some states would say, well, we're going to keep him on the ballot anyway. But I mean, really, it's going to have, as Justice Kagan said, the effect of Colorado deciding. And it's true. I just want to push back a little bit on, well, it's a national thing because this court will decide it. You say that we have to review Colorado's factual record with clear error as the standard of review.
Terry, what do you make of that exchange, particularly given the way our election system is set up? It is a federal election, but it is also set up at the state level.
Right, and on this issue, I think the court was reflecting what the concern of many people in the country is, which is, that we'd have chaos about who gets on the ballot, and that we'll have different candidates on different ballots in different states based on the partisan leaning of that state. Justice Alito later raised the question, well, let's say there's a state that wants to disqualify Biden as an insurrectionist. You might not like their definition of it, but we got no standards here. There's no process here. There's no law that governs how you prove that, or it's a word in the Constitution, and maybe somebody's going to say, the problem at the border amounts to a betrayal of the country. And he did raise that as well. And I think that what the court was doing here was essentially saying, Colorado is taking upon itself, through its election qualification law, its state election qualification law, the power to determine for the rest of the country how this election will go. And the court seemed definitely troubled by that. And the answer of the Colorado lawyer, well, you guys, you're the Supreme Court. You'll decide the election. They did that they booked that act, as they say on Broadway, in the year 2000, and it laid an egg for the Supreme Court. They tried that with Bush versus Gore. Their popularity, their favorability, the trust in the Supreme Court collapsed in many sectors of the country. They do not want to go down that road again.
And I want to bring in our senior reporter, Catherine Falders, as well, because, Catherine, another argument that came up was that there already is sort of a safeguard in our law to protect from an insurrectionist going to office, which is conviction in the courts. Charge them in court, convict them in court, and then they won't be able to run for office. Former President Trump, of course, has not been charged with insurrection. He's not facing that, but he is facing a number of other legal cases. So what are you watching for on that front? And could any of those cases come and impact this one?
Right. I think it's 91 criminal counts total, Diane. And what we learned earlier this week from at least the D.C. Circuit Court was that they ruled that former President Trump is not immune. He doesn't have immunity for acts that he committed while president. This is something that the Circuit Court gave Trump's lawyers a deadline of this coming Monday to ask the Supreme Court to intervene in some way. So it remains to be seen what the Supreme Court will ultimately do with that, if they will issue a stay, if they won't issue a stay. That case, the federal election subversion case, seems to be moving forward in Washington, D.C. But I think it's worth pointing out, and we saw Trump there and we listened to his statement after. Again, we talk a lot about the legal world and the political world of Donald Trump colliding, but he has been using these cases, whether he appears in person at them or not. You saw him, he was down there in Mar-a-Lago reacting to it. He has been using his legal woes to capitalize on his political campaign. That was a statement reacting to the Supreme Court. He then started to talk about the border, for example. This is something that Trump, while some say that it could potentially hurt his approval rating, these legal issues that he has essentially used to capitalize on and give essentially a political campaign speech. This is something that we probably will see next week, too. Diane, you talk about all of these legal challenges. He is likely to appear at a hearing next week on Monday in Fort Pierce, Florida, in the classified documents matter. That hearing is not open. Those are under seal. But again, we could see another similar thing from Trump next week as well.
And I want to bring in 538 Politics podcast host Galen Druk for what the polls show. Galen, what do Americans think about this effort to disqualify Trump from office?
Well, stop me if you've heard this before, Diane, but Americans are pretty closely divided on the issue. So ABC News has done polling on this question of whether you support Maine and Colorado's decision to bar Trump from the primary ballot, and 49% of Americans said that they support the decision, 46% said they oppose the decision. When it comes to the actual question of what the Supreme Court should do now, about 40% say that the Supreme Court should keep him on the ballot everywhere, 30% say the Supreme Court should take him off the ballot everywhere, and a quarter say leave it up to the states to decide. So if you do that math, a majority of Americans say that the Supreme Court should either take him off the ballot or leave it up to states to decide. But I think we have to sort of dig a little deeper on this question, because I've looked at polling, and I've also been out in the field talking to voters about their understanding of Section 3 of the 14th Amendment. Now, I think it would be unrealistic to expect most Americans to know the specifics of this part of the Constitution. I mean, not only is it asking Americans to be legal scholars in some sense, it's also a part of the Constitution that has never been reviewed by the Supreme Court before. It's not like Roe v. Wade that everyone is familiar with. So I think opinions are somewhat malleable on this question. I was out, for example, talking to folks in New Hampshire leading up to the primary about what they thought of Maine taking Trump off the ballot. And as you talked with them, it felt like their opinions were evolving based on what information you were giving them. It's a complicated issue.
And one that our Stephen Portnoy actually did a deep dive into. Stephen looked at the origins of this section of the amendment. So, Stephen, I want to bring you in here to dissect some of the legalese that we heard. There was a lot of talk of officer of the United States, officer under the United States, whether Section 3 applies to Trump or not. What did you find about how the framers intended this to be interpreted?
Well, you know, it's interesting because you can read the transcripts of the congressional debate on the 14th Amendment in the Congressional Globe, a forerunner of the Congressional Record. And, you know, Congress really was intent after the Civil War on making it impossible for former Confederates to serve in federal or state offices. And that was a clear intent. It was mentioned in the oral argument today that there was actually a statute that was on the books that was meant to prevent former Confederates from serving in government, but they wanted to take a step further and put it in the Constitution. So in 1868, the 14th Amendment is ratified with this language that was meant to last for all time. And what was so interesting is to hear the justices grapple with the contemporary modern problems of enforcing the 14th Amendment, Section 3. And what was interesting to me also is the idea
Stephen, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt you for a second because
letter.
Jason Murray, the plaintiff, is now speaking outside the Supreme Court. Let's listen.
We're right and apply the law as it's written.
What makes you feel so optimistic?
Hold on, guys. One at a time. What outlet are you with?
We're so proud of you.
Here.
What if they don't?
Well, if they don't, then we, as the rest of the country should do, will abide by the result. But we're confident that they will recognize that we're right on the law.
Let's go right here.
Jake Rose with CBS News. I'm trying, the makeup of the Colorado Supreme Court is different than the court behind you. I'm just wondering how you game that out and what your expectations are and them making a decision that's not on.
Well, our expectation is that any judge, regardless of who appointed them, will do their best to apply the law as it's written and not try to achieve any political outcome. And here the law is clear in our favor.
Can I ask Norma Anderson? Hi.
Yeah, go ahead right here.
It's Mark Stone from Sky News. I wonder if I could ask you what your message is to the millions of Trump supporters around the country.
All right, so we're just hearing there from Jason Murray, one of the attorneys arguing for the plaintiffs in this case, trying to have Donald Trump removed or remain removed from the ballot in Colorado. Terry Moran, I want to go back to you for sort of final thoughts here. Where does this go from here, and what are the potential ramifications?
Well, the justices will now have to decide, and as Kate Shaw and others have noted, it looks like there's a strong majority, perhaps even a unanimous court, that will keep Donald Trump on the ballot in Colorado and write it in such a way that this 14th Amendment issue will be laid to rest in this way. That said, you know, the ramifications of it are what they have been for many years now. Since he came down the escalator, Donald Trump transformed American politics. He tests the boundaries and norms of our political system at every moment. And that's tough. And it's tough for every institution that's had to deal with him. And his populist movement, he's got a lot of support. It's tough for the Supreme Court. That's what we heard today.
Sure sounds that way. All right, Kay Shaw, Terry Moran, Steve Portnoy, Galen Druk, Rick Klein, and Catherine Falders. Thank you all. We'll be right back.
Whenever news breaks,
we are here in Israel, a nation at war after that brutal surprise attack by Hamas.
On the ground in Ukraine, reporting from Lewiston, Maine.
The scene of a horrific mass shooting.
ABC News Live is right there everywhere.
From the scene of that deadly missile strike in Dnipro, Ukraine. Reporting from the earthquake in Turkey.
In Rolling Fork, this tornado tore through this little town.
From the most devastating disaster in Hawaii.
From Charleston, South Carolina, on the 2024 campaign trail.
In Iceland, let's go.
Traveling with the president in Mexico City.
Wherever the story.
From the front lines. From southern Israel.
Outside the Gaza Strip.
In Beirut.
From the FBI.
Reporting from the nurses on the picket line.
Here at 10 Downing Street in London.
Streaming live to you.
Wherever the story is.
Wherever the story is.
Wherever the story is. We're going to take you there.
You're streaming.
ABC News Live.
ABC News Live.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live. Streaming free everywhere. America's #1 streaming news.
I have a point of contact.
They're expecting us?
This is our secret world we have.
Do you think we're going to be safe?
I don't know.
This is my pen. Inside that pen is a slice of human brain.
These are assassinations, and people are going to be murdered.
There's really no telling what some of them will do.
I'm in.
Oh, my God.
It's happening everywhere and anywhere.
Wow.
All right, here we go. You ready? Let's do it.
Yes, it's the show America wants and America needs right now.
This is What Would You Do? Let's go. How are you? Yes.
So what will you be watching Saturdays on ABC News Live?
What would you do?
Hey, I guess I just found out.
The What Would You Do Marathon, 2 to 6 Eastern, every Saturday on ABC News Live.
My favorite show. The clock is ticking with that urgent search.
For those 5 people on board the missing submersible.
Carrying tourists to the wreckage of the Titanic.
What happened to this submersible?
Titanic still fascinates people today.
What is the lesson of Titanic? Listen to the warnings.
It was almost as if the Titanic claimed 5 more victims.
Was there any warning before the submersible actually imploded?
Fatal dive to the Titanic, tonight at 8/7 Central on ABC.
Oh my! Y'all tuning in for Taylor Swift. You're gonna be tuning in for Usher too.
You're gonna do it